Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The stairs creak at 3:17 every night. I know this because I've been counting. I moved into the boarding house 6 weeks after my wife told me she didn't recognize me anymore. She said it gently, the way you might explain something terrible to someone you still love but can no longer save. I didn't argue. I had stopped recognizing myself long before she did. Somewhere between the late nights at the office and the silences that stretched like chasms across our dinner table. The divorce was clean, almost surgical in its efficiency, and when it was over, I found myself standing in the hollow shell of our apartment with nothing but a suitcase and the peculiar sensation that I had been erased from my own life. So I drove, 3 days through highways that bled into each other, past towns whose names I immediately forgot, until my car coughed its last breath in a place called Hollow Creek. Population, 847, the kind of town that exists in the spaces between larger places, forgotten by mapmakers and progress alike. The boarding house sat at the end of a dirt road, a Victorian structure that seemed to lean slightly to the left, as though it had grown tired of standing upright after a century of trying. The paint, once white I assumed, had yellowed to the color of old bone. The windows watched me as I approached, and I used that word deliberately. Watched. There was something in the way they caught the fading afternoon light, something that suggested awareness. The landlady was a woman somewhere past 70, with hands like dried leaves and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. She told me she had a room on the second floor, corner unit, good light in the mornings. When I asked about other tenants, she paused for a moment too long before saying there were 3 others. A retired school teacher, a traveling salesman who was rarely home, a young woman studying something at the community college 2 towns over. She handed me a brass key that felt heavier than it should have. The metal was cold, even though it had been sitting in her warm palm. "The house settles at night," she said, and something in her voice made me understand this was not small talk. Old bones, old wood, you'll hear things, best not to mind them. I didn't ask what things. I was too tired to ask, too hollowed out by the months of legal proceedings and the slow dismantling of a life I had thought was permanent. I just wanted to sleep. The first week passed in a gray blur. I unpacked my few belongings, clothes that no longer fit quite right, books I'd been meaning to read for years, a photograph of my parents that I placed face down in the bottom drawer because looking at it made my chest ache in ways I couldn't name. I ate breakfast in the small communal kitchen, exchanged polite nothings with the school teacher, caught glimpses of the salesman's briefcase by the front door. The young woman was a ghost. I heard her footsteps above me sometimes, but never saw her face. I slept heavily those first nights, the kind of dreamless unconsciousness that comes from complete exhaustion. I attributed the dirt under my fingernails each morning to the garden I had started half-heartedly tending behind the house. I told myself the ache in my shoulders was from hauling boxes, from adjusting to a new mattress, from the accumulated tension of a life collapsed and rebuilt. But on the 8th night, I woke to the sound of my name. Not spoken, whispered. The difference matters. It came from somewhere below me, from the direction of the stairs that led to the basement. The voice was soft, almost tender, the way someone might call to a child who had wandered too far. I lay in the darkness, my heart pressing against my ribs, and listened. The house was silent except for the usual groans of old wood settling, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I convinced myself I had dreamed it. The next night, it happened again. And the next. Always at the same time, 3:17 a.m., according to the digital clock on my nightstand, its red numerals burning in the dark like something that shouldn't be seen. Always that whisper, rising through the floorboards like vapor, curling around the syllables of my name with an intimacy that made my skin prickle. On the 12th night, I set my phone to record audio, and placed it on the floor near the heating vent that connected my room to the floors below. I fell asleep waiting, and woke at dawn to find the recording was exactly 4 hours and 32 minutes long. Static. Nothing but static, except for a 17-minute section in the middle that was simply empty, complete silence, as though the microphone had been smothered, or the air itself had stopped carrying sound. I played that section of silence over and over, straining to hear something underneath it. By the 5th repetition, I could have sworn there was a rhythm to the emptiness. A pulse, like breathing from very far away. I bought cameras, small cheap ones from the hardware store in the next town over. The only store in Hollow Creek was a general goods shop run by a man who looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language when I asked about electronics. I mounted them in the hallway outside my room, on the landing of the stairs, and above the basement door. The footage from the first night showed nothing. Empty hallways bathed in the green glow of night vision, the occasional spider crossing the frame, the slow drift of dust motes in air that never seemed to settle. I watched it at triple speed, my eyes burning, looking for any movement, any shadow that didn't belong. On the second night, I noticed the glitch. At exactly 3:17, all 3 cameras froze simultaneously. The timestamp continued to advance. 3:17:01, 3:17:02. But the images remained static, frozen frames of empty spaces. This lasted for exactly 11 minutes. At 3:28, the footage resumed as though nothing had happened. The hallways were unchanged. The doors were closed. Everything was exactly where it should be. But I wasn't in my bed when I woke up. I was on the couch in the common room downstairs, my legs dangling over the armrest, my arms crossed over my chest like a corpse prepared for viewing. My hands were caked with dirt, not the dry, crumbly soil of the garden, but something darker, wetter, with a mineral smell that reminded me of wells and graves and places where sunlight has never reached. I sat up so fast I nearly vomited. My fingernails were black with it, this wet earth, packed so deeply into the cuticles that it would take 3 scrubbings before my hands looked human again. There were smears of it on my shirt, on my pants, on the soles of my bare feet. I had no memory of leaving my room, no memory of anything after lying down to sleep. Just the whisper of my name, and then morning, and then this. This evidence of something I couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize, couldn't make fit into any framework of reality I understood. I began to stay awake. I drank coffee until my hands trembled, sat in the chair by my window with every light on, and watched the hours crawl toward 3:17. The landlady noticed the shadows under my eyes, asked if I was sleeping all right. I told her I was fine. I told everyone I was fine. The school teacher commented that I looked pale, offered me some herbal tea that she swore would help with insomnia. I thanked her and poured it down the sink when she wasn't looking. On the 3rd night of my vigil, I made it past 3 o'clock, past 3:10. I was awake. I was certain I was awake, watching the clock with an intensity that made my vision blur at the edges. 3:15, 3:16. And then I was on the couch again, the taste of soil in my mouth. A single smear of wet earth trailing from the basement door to where I lay. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I screamed until my throat was raw, until the school teacher came rushing down in her robe, until the salesman appeared in the doorway looking rumpled and confused. They asked what happened, and I couldn't tell them. What would I say? That something was taking me in the night? That I was sleepwalking into the basement to do things I couldn't remember? That I was losing my mind in this house full of old bones and older secrets? The landlady came last, moving slowly down the stairs with a candle in her hand, even though the electricity was working fine. She looked at me, at the dirt on my clothes, the wild desperation in my eyes, and her expression was unreadable. Not surprised, not concerned, something closer to recognition. The house remembers, she said softly, and turned around and went back to her room without another word. I searched the basement the next day, every inch of it. It was larger than I expected, stretching beyond the footprint of the house itself, with walls of old stone and a floor of packed earth. The kind of basement that predates the structure above it, that suggests the house was built on top of something older. There were old tools hanging on hooks, shovels and picks and implements I couldn't identify, and stacks of wooden crates that had been there so long they had begun to merge with the floor. In the far corner, I found the disturbed earth, a patch of ground roughly the size of a door, freshly turned, darker than the soil around it. When I pressed my hand to it, it was warm, body temperature warm, as though something beneath it was generating heat, or had been generating heat very recently. I dug. I don't remember deciding to dig. One moment I was crouching there, running my fingers over the soft soil, and the next, I had a shovel in my hands, and I was throwing dirt over my shoulder with the frenzied energy of someone who knows they're about to uncover something terrible. The earth was loose, easy to move, as though it had been turned many times before. I found old clothes first. A man's shirt, rotted to lace, buttons still intact. Then shoes, leather shoes, the kind no one has worn in decades. Then a pocket watch with a cracked face, stopped at 3:17. Then I hit something solid. Not bone, not wood. Something that felt like metal, curved and smooth and much too warm. I brushed the dirt away with my fingers, heart slamming against my ribs, and saw nothing. I was in my bed. Morning light was streaming through the window. My hands were clean, pink and scrubbed, and there was no dirt anywhere on my body. The shovel was back on its hook in the basement. I checked immediately, running down the stairs in my bare feet, ignoring the shocked look from the school teacher eating her breakfast. Everything was exactly where it should be, but my shoulders ached. My palms were blistered, and when I looked at my fingernails, there was the faintest trace of black soil caught beneath the edges. Soil I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I tried. I stopped trusting my own memory after that. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail of every day, what I ate, who I spoke to, where I went. I checked it obsessively, looking for gaps, for entries I didn't remember writing. For 3 days it matched my recollections perfectly. On the 4th day I found an entry in my handwriting that I had no memory of making. It wants me to finish. It has been waiting so long. The others couldn't. The others weren't strong enough. But I am. I feel it in my bones. I am the one who will finally set it free. Below this, in a script that was almost but not quite my handwriting, slightly more angular, slightly more deliberate. You know where to dig. You've always known. I burned the journal that night. I watched the pages curl and blacken, watched my own words turn to ash, and I told myself it was over. I would leave in the morning. I would pack my bags and drive until Hollow Creek was nothing but a bad memory, until this house and its whispers and its impossible basement were far enough behind me that I could pretend none of it had happened. But when morning came, I couldn't find my car keys. I searched everywhere. My room, the common areas, even the garden where I had worked those first innocent days. The landlady watched me from her window, or perhaps I imagined that. The school teacher offered to drive me to the bus station, but when we went to her car, the engine wouldn't start. The salesman's car was gone. He had left for his route 2 days ago. I was stranded, trapped in a town that had no taxis, no rental agencies, no way out except on foot through 30 miles of empty farmland. That night I barricaded my door. I wedged a chair under the handle, pushed my dresser against the frame, piled my suitcases and boxes until there was no way I could leave without waking myself up. At 3:17, I heard the whisper. At 3:28, I woke on the couch with dirt in my mouth and the landlady standing over me, her face lit by that same candle, her eyes reflecting something that might have been sorrow. "You're almost there," she said. "Just a little more." I asked her what she meant. I demanded to know what was happening to me, what was in the basement, why she had brought me here. She just smiled, a tired, ancient smile, and said something that has lodged itself in my brain like a splinter I cannot remove. "You brought yourself here. You always do. And you always will, until you remember how to stay." It has been 4 months now. I no longer try to leave. I no longer barricade my door or set up cameras or stay awake past midnight. I have accepted that there are hours of my life that belong to something else, hours when my body moves without my permission through darkened hallways toward whatever waits beneath the earth. My hands are calloused now. The blisters have become hard pads of skin, the hands of someone who has spent years digging, decades digging, perhaps longer. When I look in the mirror, I see lines on my face that weren't there before, a hollowness in my cheeks that suggests hunger, but might be something else entirely. Time moves strangely in Hollow Creek. The seasons seem to skip and stutter. I could swear I've seen the same day repeat itself, the same conversations, the same patterns of light through the same unwashed windows. The other tenants have stopped speaking to me, or perhaps they were never real. I'm no longer certain which explanation frightens me more. Last night, or what I believe was last night, I found myself awake in the basement for the first time. Not waking on the couch with no memory, but standing in the far corner with the shovel in my hands, fully conscious, fully aware, watching my arms move of their own accord as they lifted another load of wet black earth. The hole is deep now, deeper than I could have dug in any reasonable amount of time, deeper than the basement itself should allow. And at the bottom, I can see something. It's curved and smooth and made of a metal that doesn't reflect light the way metal should. It's warm. So warm I can feel the heat from where I stand. And on its surface, etched in patterns that make my eyes water when I try to focus on them, there are words, or something like words. A language I've never seen but somehow understand, the way you understand the grammar of nightmares. It says, "You are the door. You have always been the door." I don't know if I'm digging something up or digging myself in. I don't know if the whisper that calls my name each night is coming from below the earth or from inside my own skull. I don't know if there ever was a wife, a divorce, a car that broke down in a town called Hollow Creek, or if I've been here always, repeating the same night over and over, getting a little closer each time to whatever truth is buried in that impossible darkness. But my hands know what to do. And tomorrow night, or whenever 317 comes again, I'll go back down those stairs. I'll pick up the shovel. I'll dig, because the house remembers. And somewhere beneath the weight of all that earth, so do I. Story 2. The walls in old buildings remember things. I learned this 3 weeks after moving into apartment 4B, when I first heard my own voice bleeding through the plaster at 2:47 in the morning, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I found the place through a listing that seemed too good to be true. A 1-bedroom in a pre-war building on the Upper West Side, rent stabilized, available immediately. The previous tenant had left abruptly, the super told me, his accent thick and his eyes avoiding mine. Family emergency. Back to the old country. The man's furniture was still there when I toured the unit, covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts, but I was assured everything would be cleared before my move-in date. I signed the lease that afternoon. The building had the particular smell of old Manhattan real estate, decades of cooking oil embedded in crown molding, radiator steam carrying traces of 100 winters, and something else beneath it all. Something organic and faintly sweet that I couldn't quite identify. I told myself it was just the age of the place, the accumulated breath of everyone who had ever lived within these walls. I'm a software engineer by trade, which means I notice patterns, discrepancies, things that don't quite compile. So when I was reviewing the floor plan included in my lease documents, a habit born from my obsessive need to plan furniture placement, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The blueprint showed a second bedroom. According to the official layout, there should have been a door on the eastern wall of my living room, leading to a space roughly 12 by 14 feet. But when I stood in my actual apartment, that wall was solid. No door. No indication there had ever been one. Just faded wallpaper featuring a repeating pattern of pale blue flowers that seemed to shift slightly when viewed in peripheral vision. I assumed it was a clerical error. An old floor plan from before some renovation sealed the room. Buildings change over time, walls go up, spaces get absorbed. I made a mental note to ask the superintendent about it and promptly forgot. For the first 2 weeks, I was too busy with work to pay much attention to the apartment's peculiarities. My company had just launched a new product, and I spent most of my waking hours in front of 3 monitors, debugging code that seemed to develop new errors faster than I could fix them. I ate takeout standing over the kitchen sink. I slept in 4-hour bursts. The apartment was just a place where I occasionally closed my eyes. But then the project shipped, and suddenly I had time. Time to notice how the floorboards in the hallway creaked in a rhythm that almost sounded like footsteps. Time to observe that the shadows in the corner of my bedroom didn't quite correspond to the furniture casting them. Time to realize that I never heard my neighbors, not through the ceiling, not through the floor, not through any wall except one, the eastern wall, the one hiding the room that didn't exist. From behind that wall came the unmistakable sounds of habitation, the scrape of chair legs against hardwood, the soft thud of objects being set down on surfaces. Once, what sounded like muffled laughter, though it stopped so abruptly I convinced myself I had imagined it. I told myself it was the apartment next door. Sound travels strangely in old buildings. Everyone knows that. The pipes carry echoes. The walls breathe and settle. There were rational explanations for everything. Then came the night of October 14th. I had fallen asleep on my couch around midnight, laptop still warm on my chest. Some documentary about deep-sea creatures droning from the television. I woke to darkness. The TV had turned itself off, and to a sound that made my blood feel like ice water moving too slowly through my veins. Voices, coming from behind the eastern wall. 2 of them engaged in what sounded like intimate conversation, the kind of low murmuring that happens between people who know each other well. I held my breath, listened. One of the voices was mine. Not similar to mine. Could be mistaken for mine. It was my voice, with my particular cadence, my habit of trailing off mid-sentence, even that slight rasp I get when I've been talking too long. I heard myself say something I couldn't quite make out, then laugh. That uncomfortable laugh I do when I'm nervous, the one my college roommate used to mock. The other voice responded. It was deeper, older somehow, and spoke in a language I didn't recognize. Not Spanish or French or any of the languages I might expect in New York. It sounded ancient, the consonants clicking and sliding in ways that seemed to bypass my ears and register somewhere deeper, in the base of my skull. I should have called the police. I should have pounded on the wall and demanded answers. Instead, I sat frozen on my couch, sweat cooling on my skin, listening to myself have a conversation I had no memory of starting. The voices stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. I know because I was watching the clock on my microwave, its green digits the only light in the apartment, counting the seconds until silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went to the superintendent's office in the basement. He was an older man, with hands that looked like they had been repairing things for longer than I had been alive. When I asked about the floor plan discrepancy, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or fear. He told me the building had been renovated in 1987. The extra room was sealed because of structural concerns. Old water damage, nothing worth worrying about. I asked him why I could hear voices coming from an empty sealed room. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes roomy but sharp, and told me that old buildings make strange noises. Then he asked me, very quietly, if I had been sleeping well, if I had been under stress at work, if I had a history of hearing things that weren't there. I left his office feeling more unsettled than when I'd arrived. That night, I pressed my ear directly against the eastern wall. The plaster was cold, colder than it should have been, given that my radiator was hissing away, and slightly damp to the touch. I stood there for what felt like hours, barely breathing, waiting. At first, nothing. Just the ambient noise of the city filtering through my windows, the distant wail of sirens, the rumble of trucks on Amsterdam Avenue. Then my voice started speaking, clear as if I were standing right next to myself. It was describing my day. Every detail. The eggs I'd burned at breakfast. The error message I'd struggled with at work. The way the cashier at the bodega had looked at me strangely when I'd paid for my coffee. It recounted my life back to me with perfect accuracy, including thoughts I'd had but never spoken aloud. The other voice responded, and this time I caught a few words in English, embedded in that strange clicking language like fossils in sedimentary rock. It said, "Almost ready," and "Not much longer," and most disturbingly, "He's listening right now." I yanked my ear away from the wall. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, in my temples, in the soft tissue behind my eyes. There was a moment of silence. Then, from behind the wall, I heard myself laugh. I started researching the building, obsessively. I found records at the public library, newspaper archives online, anything I could dig up about 247 West 89th Street. The building was constructed in 1923. The original owner was a textile merchant who had made his fortune in imports from places that no longer exist on modern maps. He had lived in the penthouse until his disappearance in 1931. The newspapers called it unexplained, noted that his apartment had been found locked from the inside with no sign of forced entry, and moved on to other stories. Since then, apartment 4B had seen a rotation of tenants that seemed unusually rapid. The building records showed an average tenancy of 8 months. Several had left in the middle of their leases. 2 had been hospitalized for what the records vaguely termed nervous exhaustion. One tenant, a music teacher who had lived in 4B in 1967, had left a note in the margins of her lease termination form. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, but I managed to make out the words. "The room remembers. It's learning to speak with borrowed voices." I should have moved out. The rational part of my brain, the part that debugs code and optimizes algorithms, was screaming at me to pack my things and leave. But there was another part, a part I didn't recognize, that needed to understand. I started recording. Every night I set up my phone to capture audio while I slept. Every morning I would listen back, scrubbing through hours of silence punctuated by my own snoring and the occasional car alarm. On the 5th night of recording, I found something. At 3:17 a.m., there was a sound of my bedroom door opening, footsteps crossing the floor, then my voice, but coming from across the room, not from my position in bed, saying, "Not yet. He's not ready yet." And then another voice, the old voice, responding in that impossible language before adding, in perfectly accented English, "Patience. The door opens both ways." I listened to that recording 47 times. I analyzed the waveforms. I ran the audio through every filter I knew. The recording was genuine. The voices were real. But I had no memory of getting out of bed, no memory of speaking, no memory of anything except troubled dreams about rooms that were bigger on the inside than the outside, about walls that breathed, about a door that had always been there even when it wasn't. I've started noticing other things now. My reflection in the bathroom mirror moves a fraction of a second too slow. When I turn my head quickly, I catch it still facing forward before it snaps to follow. My coworkers have commented that I seem different lately, quieter, more distracted, sometimes in the middle of sentences that I don't remember starting. Last Tuesday I found muddy footprints in my hallway. They led from the eastern wall to my bedroom door and back again. The mud was dark, almost black, and when I touched it, it felt like touching static electricity, like touching the memory of cold. I measured the apartment yesterday. According to my tape measure, the eastern wall is exactly where it should be, leaving no space for a hidden room. But when I stand in the center of my living room and close my eyes, I can feel the extra space pressing against my consciousness. It's there. The room is there. And something inside it is wearing my voice, like a borrowed coat. Tonight, as I write this, I can hear the conversation starting again. My voice is describing this very moment. The laptop warm on my thighs, the untouched cup of tea going cold on the side table, the way my hands tremble slightly over the keys. The other voice is responding with what sounds almost like approval. I'm going to try something. I'm going to answer back. I know I shouldn't. I know that some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. But I need to understand. I need to know if the voice behind the wall is really me, or if I'm the voice in this room, slowly becoming something else. The blueprint says there's a room there. The wall says there isn't. But blueprints don't lie. Maybe walls do. The document ends here, a handwritten note. Added later in increasingly erratic script reads, "The door was always there. I just couldn't see it until I stopped looking. Now it won't close. Now it won't close. Now it won't close." The final word trails off the page. Story 3. The desert has a way of making you feel small. Not just physically, though there's plenty of that. Miles of nothing stretching toward horizons you'll never reach, but spiritually, existentially. Out here, beneath a sky crowded with stars that have watched civilizations rise and crumble, you understand that you are temporary, forgettable, a flicker of warmth crossing cold, indifferent sand. I had been driving for 6 hours when I first saw the lights. My gas gauge had been hovering near empty for the last 30 miles, a fact I'd been steadfastly ignoring because the GPS promised a station at exit 147. The screen glowed pale blue against my dashboard, that calm robotic voice assuring me every few minutes that my destination was approaching. 12 miles, 8 miles, 4, and then, rising from the darkness like something surfacing from deep water, the station appeared. It was old. That was my first impression. The kind of old that suggests not just age, but abandonment, a place the world had simply forgotten to demolish. The canopy over the pumps sagged slightly in the middle, its fluorescent lights buzzing with that particular frequency that sets your teeth on edge. The building itself was a squat rectangle of faded brick, windows dark except for one section near the front where a neon open sign flickered arrhythmically, casting red shadows that pulsed like a wound. I pulled up to the pump closest to the building. The engine ticked as it cooled, and in that sudden silence I became aware of how absolute the quiet was. No traffic noise, no wind, not even the distant yip of coyotes that you'd expect out here. Just the buzz of those lights and somewhere inside the building, the tinny murmur of a radio. The pump was ancient, the kind with a mechanical display that rolled numbers instead of digital readout. I inserted my card, half expecting it to be rejected, but the machine accepted it with a grinding click. As gas flowed into my tank, I studied the station more carefully. No other cars, no attendant visible through the windows. The door to the shop stood slightly ajar, and from inside, I could hear that radio more clearly now. Not music, but voices. A talk show, maybe. Two people engaged in what sounded like an intimate conversation, their words muffled by distance and static, but carrying a cadence that felt somehow familiar. The pump clicked off. I replaced the nozzle, but instead of getting back in my car, I found myself walking toward that open door. I told myself I needed water, maybe something caffeinated. A reasonable excuse, but there was something else pulling me forward. A curiosity I couldn't quite name. The inside of the shop smelled like dust and something sweeter underneath. Old candy, maybe, or the chemical ghost of air freshener applied years ago and never quite dissipated. Shelves lined the narrow aisles, stocked with products in packaging I didn't recognize. Not vintage exactly, but off somehow, like someone had described common brands from memory and gotten the details slightly wrong. The radio sat on the counter, a boxy transistor model that belonged in a museum. The two voices I'd heard from outside were clearer now, and as I approached, the words began to separate themselves from the static. Always wondered if she actually loved him, or if she just couldn't imagine being alone. That's the thing, though, he knew. Deep down, he knew it wasn't real love. It was just fear wearing love's clothes. I froze. My hand had been reaching for a bottle of water in the cooler, but now it hung suspended in the air, trembling slightly. They were talking about my marriage. Not explicitly, no names, no specific details, but the conversation tracked perfectly with thoughts I'd had during the divorce 3 years ago. Private thoughts, the kind you don't even admit to your therapist because they make you sound pathetic and small. He tells himself the driving helps, one voice continued. All those long trips alone in the car. He thinks he's processing, but really he's just running. He's been running since he was 12 years old, since that night in the basement when I slammed my palm against the radio. The voices cut out, replaced by a burst of static that quickly faded to silence. My heart was hammering, and I could feel sweat prickling at my hairline despite the shop's air-conditioned chill, a mechanical malfunction, some kind of bizarre coincidence. That's what I told myself as I grabbed a water bottle and a pack of gum, normal purchases, normal behavior, and approached the register. There was no one behind the counter. I waited, cleared my throat, called out a tentative hello that disappeared into the aisles without response. The register, like the pump, was an antique. But when I pressed what I assumed was the total button, the drawer popped open with a cheerful ding. Inside, arranged in neat rows, were bills and coins, waiting for me to make change for myself. I left a 20. The water was probably worth $2. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. Outside, the night had grown thicker somehow, the stars less visible than before. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway with a sense of relief that bordered on euphoria. The GPS screen glowed its familiar blue. "Continue on Highway 93 for 47 miles, it announced. "Then take exit 152 toward..." I didn't hear the rest. I was focused on the road, on putting distance between myself and that impossible station. The radio stayed off. I didn't trust myself to hear what might come through it. 20 minutes passed. 30. The landscape scrolled by unchanged, sagebrush and sand and the occasional twisted Joshua tree reaching toward the sky like a supplicant. My eyelids grew heavy. The white lines hypnotized me into something approaching calm. "Recalculating," the GPS announced. I blinked, focused on the screen. The map had shifted, the route highlighted in a new configuration. "Take exit 147 in 3 miles. Your destination is on the right." No, that wasn't right. I'd already passed exit 147. I'd been driving for half an hour. The exits went up in number, not down. That was how highways worked. But there it was, materializing from the darkness ahead. A green sign, reflective letters spelling out exit 147, and beyond it, those same sagging lights, that same flickering neon, that same squat building rising from the desert floor. The station. I pressed the accelerator, pushing past the exit without slowing. The speedometer climbed, 60, 70, 80. The GPS went silent, and for a glorious moment, I thought I'd broken free. Then, recalculating. "Take exit 147 in 3 miles. I looked in the rearview mirror. Behind me, the station's lights were still visible, dwindling but present. Ahead, nothing but empty highway. 3 miles. I watched the odometer tick upward. Watched the GPS count down the distance with mechanical patience. The sign appeared. Exit 147. The station materialized beside it, identical in every detail, as though it had simply leapfrogged ahead to wait for me. This time I stopped. I pulled into the same spot by the same pump, and for a long moment, I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But the station was real. I could see it, could hear the buzz of those lights, could smell the gasoline and dust through my cracked window. Maybe I'd fallen asleep. Maybe I was still asleep, caught in one of those recursive dreams where you wake up only to find yourself in another layer of the same nightmare. I pinched my arm, hard enough to leave a mark. The pain was vivid, immediate, real. I got out of the car. The shop door was open, just as before. The radio was playing, just as before. But this time, as I approached, I could hear a third voice beneath the other two. Softer, more distant, speaking in what sounded like questions rather than statements. Doesn't understand why he can't remember their names. All those people at the funeral, and he can't picture a single face. Isn't that strange? Isn't that the kind of thing a person should remember? I stopped at the threshold. My mother's funeral, 5 years ago. The voice was right. I couldn't remember any of the faces, only a sea of dark clothing and murmured condolences. I'd always attributed it to grief, to the protective fog the mind constructs around trauma. But now, standing in the doorway of this impossible place, I wasn't sure what to attribute anything to anymore. Maybe he doesn't want to remember, one of the original voices replied. Maybe forgetting is easier than facing what actually happened. What do you mean? You know what I mean. You've always known. Why else would you drive through deserts in the middle of the night? Why else would you choose roads where no one can reach you? The radio's static swelled, and for a moment, I thought I heard a fourth voice, deeper, rougher, speaking in a language I couldn't identify but somehow understood. It was saying my name, Aang. Not my actual name, but something more fundamental, the sound that existed before names were invented. I backed away from the door. Outside, my car sat waiting beneath the buzzing lights. I got in, started the engine, pulled onto the highway. The GPS immediately announced that my destination was 3 miles ahead, exit 147, and I knew, with a certainty that felt like sickness, that it was telling the truth. I pulled to the side of the road. For a long time, I just sat there, engine idling, staring at the empty stretch of asphalt ahead. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I closed my eyes and tried to pray. No words came. Instead, memories surfaced, unbidden. The basement they'd mentioned. The summer I turned 12. The sound of my father's voice rising and falling in rhythm with the thing he was doing that I had made myself forget. The divorce. My ex-wife standing in our kitchen with her bags packed, telling me that loving me was like loving a ghost. She could see through me to the empty space where a person should be. My mother's funeral, the faces I couldn't remember, because I hadn't really been there, not in any way that mattered. I'd been somewhere else, somewhere far inside myself, watching through glass. The radio turned on. I hadn't touched it. My hands were still pressed together, still trying to form some shape that might pass for prayer. But there it was, speakers hissing with static, and through that static, a voice that was unmistakably my own. You can't keep driving, it said. You can't keep pretending there's somewhere else to go. This is the only stop. This has always been the only stop. I opened my eyes. Through the windshield, I could see the station's lights in the distance. Behind me or ahead, I couldn't tell anymore. The desert stretched in all directions, flat and featureless, a stage set for something I didn't want to witness. What do you want? I whispered. The static shifted, coalesced, and for a moment, I thought I heard laughter, or crying, or both. Sounds that had traveled so far they'd lost their original meaning. The same thing you want. To stop running. To finally look at what you've been carrying all these years. To put it down. I looked at my hands. They were shaking badly now, and in the pale light of the dashboard, they seemed older than I remembered. Veined, spotted, the hands of someone who had lived too long with too many secrets. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, the radio said, in my voice but kinder, sadder. You do. The GPS chirped. 3 miles to exit 147. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway, and the station's lights grew brighter ahead, and somewhere in the static, the voices continued their conversation about a man who drove through deserts because he couldn't stand to be still, who chose empty roads because emptiness was the only landscape that matched the space inside him. I drove toward the station. I had been driving toward it my whole life. Maybe I would stop again. Maybe I would finally go inside, really inside, past the shelves of wrong-looking products and the self-service register, and the ancient radio-speaking truths I'd spent decades avoiding. Maybe I would find what was waiting for me there. An attendant, an answer, an ending of some kind. Or maybe I would keep driving, circling back to exit 147 again and again until the sun came up or the gas ran out, or I finally understood that there was no exit. There had never been an exit. That some roads don't lead anywhere, except deeper into the territories we spend our lives trying to leave behind. The lights of the station filled my windshield. The radio played static that sounded like breathing. And somewhere out in the desert, the night waited with infinite patience for me to make a choice I had been postponing since I was 12 years old. Since that basement. Since the moment I first learned that there were things worse than darkness. The pump waited. The door stood open. I pulled in. Story 4. The first thing you learn about working night security is that silence has texture. It presses against your eardrums like wet cotton, and after enough hours alone, you start to hear things that aren't there. At least that's what I told myself during my first week at the museum. The building had been closed for renovations since early spring, something about updating the electrical system and reinforcing the foundation. The town council wanted the place ready for the centennial celebration in October, which gave the contractors exactly 4 months to gut the interior and put it back together. My job was simple: sit in the security office from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, watch the cameras, and make rounds every 2 hours. The pay was decent, the work was easy, and I needed something to fill the hours since the factory shut down. The museum itself was unremarkable, a converted Victorian mansion that the town had stuffed with local artifacts over the decades: Native American arrowheads in glass cases, taxidermied animals from the surrounding forests, old photographs of founding families with their dead-eyed stares and rigid postures. The kind of place that field trip buses visited once a year, where children pressed their noses against display cases and promptly forgot everything they saw. During the day, construction crews tore out walls and rewired circuits. At night, I inherited their mess: exposed beams, plastic sheeting, the smell of sawdust and old varnish. The security system was ancient but functional, feeding grainy black and white footage from 12 cameras to a bank of monitors in what used to be the butler's pantry. I remember the exact moment things started to feel wrong. It was my 4th night, around 2 in the morning. I was making my first round of the evening, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the east wing. The electricity had been disconnected in that section, and the only light came from the emergency exit signs casting their red glow over everything like a developing room. I was walking past the display of Victorian mourning jewelry, hair woven into brooches, photographs of the deceased in ornate frames, when I heard something behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of fabric brushing against fabric, the soft whisper of movement. I spun around, flashlight stabbing into the darkness. Nothing. Just the empty hallway, the plastic sheeting hanging from the ceiling like shed skin, and the glass cases reflecting my own pale face back at me. I stood there for a long moment, listening to my heartbeat thud in my ears. The silence had that thick quality again, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Then I laughed, a short, nervous sound that echoed strangely, and continued my round. When I returned to the security office, I rewound the footage from the East Wing camera. The image was poor quality, full of static and shadows, but I could see myself walking through the frame. And behind me, just at the edge of visibility, something else seemed to move. A darkness that shifted against the other darkness. I watched the clip 3 times, 4 times, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, the plastic sheeting caught in some unfelt draft. I almost believed it. The next few nights I started paying closer attention to the monitors. The cameras covered most of the building, though several had been repositioned during the renovation and now showed odd angles. Corners of rooms, sections of ceiling, empty spaces that seemed to serve no purpose. I noticed that certain areas of the footage always seemed slightly out of focus, as if the lenses were smeared with something I couldn't clean off. And in those blurred spaces, things moved. I would catch them from the corner of my eye. Shapes drifting between the display cases, shadows that didn't correspond to any object I could identify. Whenever I looked directly at a monitor, whatever I'd seen would already be gone, leaving only the static hiss of empty rooms. I started keeping a log, writing down the times and locations of each sighting, trying to find a pattern. The entries grew longer each night. 2:47 a.m., camera 6 West Gallery, movement near the mineralogy display. Lasted approximately 3 seconds. 3:15 a.m., camera 9, main staircase. Shadow ascending stairs. No corresponding figure visible. 4:02 a.m., camera 3, east wing. Distinct humanoid shape standing in corner. Looked away for 2 seconds. Gone when I looked back. I told myself I was overtired. The isolation was playing tricks on my mind, the way it does when you spend too many hours in darkness surrounded by the preserved remnants of other people's lives. The museum was full of dead things, dead animals, dead fashions, dead faces staring out from photographs taken a century ago. It made sense that my brain would start populating the emptiness with phantoms, but the log kept growing. On the 9th night, something changed. I was watching the monitors around 3:30, fighting the heaviness in my eyelids, when camera 7 caught my attention. It covered the second floor's main exhibition hall, a large room filled with local history displays, mannequins dressed in period clothing, dioramas depicting scenes from the town's past. The image was clearer than usual, the static reduced to a gentle snow at the edges of the frame. And there, standing behind the glass case that held a collection of antique pocket watches, was a figure. It was me, not a shadow, not a blur. Me, wearing the same uniform, the same face, standing perfectly still with hands at my sides. The figure was looking directly at the camera, or rather, looking through it, looking at me. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went cold. I leaned closer to the monitor, certain I was misinterpreting what I saw, that the grainy footage was creating a false pattern that my exhausted mind was assembling into something familiar. The figure on the screen tilted its head slightly, just a few degrees, curious, patient. I grabbed my flashlight and ran. The second floor was empty when I burst through the door, my breath coming in sharp gasps that fogged in the cold air. I swept the beam across the exhibition hall, over the mannequins with their blank faces, the glass cases with their carefully arranged artifacts. Nothing moved. No one was there. But when I returned to the security office, the figure was still on the monitor, still standing behind the display case, still watching. I called my supervisor from the landline in the office. My cell phone never got reception inside the old building. I told him I thought someone had broken in, that I'd seen an intruder on the cameras. He asked me to describe what I was seeing, and I found the words catching in my throat. How could I explain that I was watching myself on a security feed? That the version of me on the screen was standing motionless in a room I had just confirmed was empty? He told me to stay calm. He said he would send someone to check on me in the morning. He suggested I might want to step outside for some fresh air. I stayed in the security office instead, watching the monitors. The figure didn't move for the rest of my shift. It just stood there, behind the glass, its eyes fixed on the camera with an expression I couldn't read. When my replacement arrived at 7, I showed him the footage. He squinted at the screen, scratched his head, and told me he didn't see anything unusual, just empty rooms and old displays. I drove home as the sun came up, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't sleep that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself standing in the darkness, waiting. The following nights blurred together in a haze of dread and exhaustion. The figure appeared on different cameras each shift, sometimes in the east wing, sometimes near the main entrance, once in the basement by the old furnace that hadn't worked in decades. It was always me, always watching, always positioned just behind some barrier. A display case, a door frame, a sheet of plastic hanging from the ceiling. I started taking detailed notes, trying to understand the rules of whatever was happening. The figure never appeared on more than one camera at a time. It never moved while I was watching directly, only when I glanced away, only in my peripheral vision, and it was getting closer. On the 12th night, it appeared on camera 2, which covered the hallway outside the security office. I could see myself standing at the far end of the corridor, half hidden behind a stack of construction materials. The distance between us was maybe 40 feet. I sat paralyzed in my chair, watching the monitor, afraid to look away. My doppelganger stood motionless for almost an hour. Then, in the split second I blinked, it was 10 feet closer. I didn't leave the security office for the rest of my shift. I pushed a desk against the door and sat with my back to the wall, watching the monitors rotate through their feeds. The figure remained in the hallway, inching closer with each moment of inattention, until by sunrise it was standing directly outside the door. The footage showed it reaching for the handle. Then the morning security guard knocked, and everything was normal again. I should have quit. Anyone reasonable would have quit. But something kept me coming back. A compulsion I couldn't explain. A need to understand what was happening to me. I started researching the museum's history, spending my days in the local library digging through old newspapers and town records. The building had been a private residence before it became a museum. A wealthy family had lived there in the late 1800s. There were rumors of a tragedy, though the details varied depending on the source. A disappearance. A man who walked into the house one evening and was never seen leaving. I found a photograph of him in one of the archived newspapers. He was standing in front of the mansion, hands at his sides, staring directly at the camera with an expression I recognized. He had my face. Or rather, I had his face. Or perhaps neither of us had ever had a face of our own. On the 15th night, I made a decision. Instead of sitting in the security office, I would go to whatever room the figure appeared in. I would confront it. I would understand it. The figure appeared on camera 7 again, the second-floor exhibition hall, behind the pocket watch display. I took my flashlight and walked upstairs with deliberate slowness, my footsteps echoing in the darkness. The beam-illuminated dust motes swirling in the air, the glass eyes of taxidermied animals tracking my movement, the faces of mannequins turning almost imperceptibly as I passed. The exhibition hall was cold, my breath plumed white in front of me. I approached the pocket watch display and looked behind it. Nothing. I stood there for a long moment, disappointment and relief warring in my chest. Then I turned around and saw the monitors I'd set up throughout the building. Small portable screens I'd placed in strategic locations so I could observe myself during my rounds. On every screen I was standing behind the display case, watching myself. And on camera 12, the one that covered the security office, I saw myself sitting at the desk, staring at the monitors, hands folded, expression blank. The version of me in the security office looked up slowly, as if sensing my attention. It raised one hand and placed it flat against the monitor screen. On the portable screen I was watching, I saw my own hand rise to meet it. I don't remember deciding to move. I don't remember walking. But suddenly I was back in the security office, standing in the doorway, looking at an empty chair. The monitors showed every room in the museum. In each one, I was standing, watching, waiting. The recordings are the worst part. I've started reviewing the footage from my shifts, trying to piece together what's real. In every recording, there are 2 of me. One making rounds, checking doors, writing in the logbook. The other standing still, observing, always partially hidden behind something. And the recordings don't end when my shift does. They continue for hours after I've gone home, showing both versions of myself moving through the building in perfect synchronization, performing tasks I don't remember, speaking words I can't hear. Last night, I watched a recording from camera 4. The timestamp showed 3 in the afternoon, 8 hours after my shift ended, while I should have been asleep in my apartment across town. The footage showed me walking through the main gallery, pausing in front of a display of Victorian-era mirrors. I watched myself reach out and touch the glass. My reflection didn't move, but something behind the mirror did. I'm writing this during my shift. It's almost 4 in the morning, and the figure hasn't appeared yet tonight. The monitors show empty rooms, static, darkness, but I can feel something watching me, a pressure at the back of my skull, a crawling sensation along my spine. I've started to wonder which one of us is real. Maybe I'm the one standing behind the displays, watching some other version of myself pretend to be alive. Maybe I've been the reflection all along, and the thing on the monitors is the original, trying to reclaim what was taken from it. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe we're both ghosts haunting each other across some invisible boundary. The pocket watches in the display case are all stopped at the same time, 3:33 a.m. I just checked my watch. It's 3:33 a.m. On camera 7, I can see myself standing behind the display, but this time, I'm smiling. I don't think I've smiled in weeks. I'm going to go upstairs now. I'm going to stand in front of that display case and wait for the other one to arrive. One of us will have to make a choice eventually, to step forward, to acknowledge the other, to accept whatever truth has been hiding behind the glass all along. The monitors will record everything. Someone will review the footage in the morning. But I'm no longer certain which version of me will be watching. Story 5. The first time I noticed him, I thought it was a trick of the light. 3 weeks into working from home, the apartment had become a kind of sensory deprivation chamber. Same walls, same hum of the refrigerator, same view of the brick building across the narrow street. My desk faced the window because the real estate agent had called it natural lighting. But what she meant was that the apartment was too small to face any other direction. So I stared at windows. Dozens of them, stacked like cells in a hive, most of them dark or curtained. Most of them unremarkable, except for one. It was directly across from mine, maybe 40 feet away, close enough to see details if I squinted, far enough to maintain the illusion of privacy. The apartment behind that window was laid out exactly like mine. Same galley kitchen visible through an archway to the left. Same built-in bookshelf against the back wall. Same positioning of what appeared to be a desk, facing outward, toward me. I told myself it was coincidence. These buildings were constructed in the same decade, probably by the same developer. Mirror image floor plans. It made sense. What didn't make sense was the man sitting at that desk. He had my build, average height, shoulders slightly hunched from years of computer work. He wore the same gray hoodie I was wearing, the one with the fraying cuffs that I kept meaning to throw away. His hair was dark, like mine, cut short in the same unremarkable style. When he lifted a coffee mug to his lips, I realized I was holding my own mug, halfway to my mouth, frozen in the act of drinking. I set the mug down. He set his down too, but he set his down first. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept getting up to check the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer across the street. His apartment was dark, just like mine should have been, just like a normal person's apartment would be at 3 a.m. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the building settle around me. Pipes groaning, floorboards creaking in the unit above, the distant wail of a siren somewhere in the city. The next morning I positioned my laptop so I could work while keeping the window in my peripheral vision. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that I'd been isolated too long, that my brain was manufacturing patterns where none existed, that this was what happened when your only social interaction for weeks was a grocery delivery driver who left bags outside your door. At 10:47 a.m., I watched the man across the street stand up from his desk and walk toward his kitchen. 3 seconds later, I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to get more coffee. I stood up. I walked toward my kitchen. I stopped halfway there, my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned back to the window. He was already in his kitchen, pouring water into a kettle. I hadn't done that yet. I hadn't even decided if I wanted coffee or tea. But there he was, making the choice for me, or before me, as if he knew what I was going to do before I did it. I forced myself to sit back down. I did not make coffee. I did not make tea. I sat at my desk with my hands flat on the surface, and I watched him return to his own desk with a steaming mug, and I felt something cold settle into the pit of my stomach. He glanced up at his window, at me, and even from 40 feet away, even through 2 panes of glass and the gray morning light, I could have sworn he smiled. The next few days became an exercise in observation. I kept a notebook, actual pen and paper, because something about typing it felt too impermanent, too easily deleted. I logged times, actions, discrepancies. The results were consistent and impossible. Tuesday, 2:15 p.m. Subject stands, stretches, walks to bookshelf. I feel compelled to stretch 30 seconds later. I resist. Subject returns to desk with a book I cannot identify. Tuesday, 6:30 p.m. Subject turns on lamp. Sun has not yet set. I think about turning on my own lamp. The thought feels foreign, implanted. I do not turn on the lamp. I sit in gathering darkness until my eyes ache. Wednesday, 11 a.m. Subject receives delivery. I hear my own buzzer 7 minutes later. Same brown box, same size. I do not open it. The box sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days. I didn't remember ordering anything. I couldn't remember the last time I'd ordered anything except groceries. But there it was, with my name on the label, with an address I'd never given to anyone. My previous address, 3 states away, forwarded somehow to this apartment I'd only lived in for 2 months. I finally opened it on Friday morning, my hands trembling slightly as I cut through the tape. Inside, nested in brown packing paper, was a pair of binoculars. No invoice, no return address. Just the binoculars, compact and expensive looking, with lenses that gleamed like dark eyes. I looked across the street. He was holding an identical pair, adjusting the focus dial, pointing them directly at me. I stopped leaving the apartment. I told myself it was because I didn't need to. I could work from home. I could order delivery. I could exist entirely within these 4 walls, without ever stepping into the hallway or the elevator or the street below. But the truth was simpler and more humiliating. I was afraid of what I might see if I went outside. Would I see him? Would he be waiting for me on the corner, 3 minutes ahead, already crossing the street I was about to cross? Would I pass him on the sidewalk and finally see his face clearly, finally confirm what I already knew in some deep, primitive part of my brain? So I stayed inside, and I watched, and I took notes, and I felt myself sliding into something that might have been madness, or might have been clarity. I could no longer tell the difference. The binoculars helped. That was the worst part. They brought him into sharp focus, close enough that I could see the grain of his wooden desk, the titles on his bookshelf, the specific shade of gray in his hoodie. Close enough that I could see his face. It was my face. Not similar, not resembling. Mine. The same slightly crooked nose I'd broken playing basketball in high school. The same scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood fall. The same way my jaw tightened when I was concentrating. The same furrow between my brows that had deepened over the past year. He looked up from his computer and met my gaze through the binoculars. His expression was patient, almost pitying. Like he'd been waiting for me to reach this moment of recognition. Like everything was proceeding according to a schedule I didn't have access to. He held up a piece of paper. I adjusted the focus, my fingers numb and clumsy. The paper had writing on it, large block letters that I could just barely make out. Stop fighting it. I dropped the binoculars. They hit my desk with a clatter that seemed too loud in the silent apartment. When I looked across the street again, unaided, his window was dark. His apartment was empty. There was no desk, no bookshelf, no lamp. There was nothing. I called my brother that night. We hadn't spoken in months. He lived on the other side of the country, wrapped up in his own life, his own family, his own concerns. But he was the only person I could think of who might understand, or at least pretend to. I told him about the apartment, the man, the mirror image life. I told him about the binoculars and the note and the way the apartment had seemed to simply cease existing the moment I looked away. There was a long pause when I finished. I could hear his kids in the background, laughing at something, living in a world where apartments didn't empty themselves and reflections didn't move independently. He suggested gently that I might want to talk to someone, a professional. He said the words isolation and stress and pandemic like they were diagnoses, like they explained everything. He said he was worried about me. He said he loved me. He didn't say he believed me. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. I didn't look at the window. I didn't want to know if the apartment across the street was occupied again, if he was back at his desk, if he was watching me not watch him. But eventually, inevitably, I looked. The apartment was lit. He was there. And he was on the phone, holding it to his ear exactly the way I had been holding mine. His lips moving in what might have been the same conversation I just had, the same words of concern and dismissal, the same hollow promise to take care of himself. He hung up. I had already hung up. But his movement came first, his arm lowering, his phone being set on the desk, his shoulders sagging with the same defeated exhaustion I felt in my own body. The gap was widening. At first he'd been seconds ahead of me. Now it was minutes, sometimes longer. I started to wonder what would happen when the gap became hours, days, weeks. I started to wonder if I was the one ahead and he was the one trying to catch up. The city outside my window continued its indifferent existence. Cars passed, people walked dogs. The coffee shop on the corner opened and closed according to its posted hours. None of them looked up. None of them noticed the man in the window across the street, or the man in my window, or the way our lives had become tangled in some impossible knot. I stopped working. I stopped eating regular meals. I stopped keeping track of time in any meaningful way. The notebook filled with observations grew thicker, then stopped entirely when I realized I was writing the same entries over and over, word for word, as if my hand was moving through grooves worn into reality. The binoculars sat on my desk. I hadn't touched them since the note. I didn't need to. I could feel him watching me without looking, the same way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. One night, I don't know which night, they had all blurred together. I woke to find myself standing at the window. I had no memory of getting out of bed. I was simply there, my palm pressed flat against the cold glass, my breath fogging the surface in rhythmic clouds. Across the street, he was standing at his window too, palm pressed flat, breath fogging. But his fog was already dissipating by the time mine appeared, as if he'd been standing there longer, as if he'd arrived first, as he always arrived first. I watched his lips move. I couldn't hear him. 40 feet and 2 panes of glass separated us, but I felt the words in my chest, in the hollow space behind my sternum, where something like certainty used to live. You already know. I did. That was the worst part. I already knew. I had always known. The building management office was in the basement, a windowless room that smelled like industrial carpet and old coffee. The super was a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a perpetual frown, and she looked at me like I was a problem she didn't have time for. I asked about the apartment across the street, the one on the 4th floor, directly opposite mine. I asked who lived there. She squinted at me. She said she didn't manage that building. Different owner, different management company. I'd have to ask them. I asked if she knew whether that apartment was occupied, if she'd ever seen anyone coming or going, if she'd noticed anything unusual. Her frown deepened. She told me, in a tone that suggested this conversation was over, that the building across the street had been undergoing renovations for the past 6 months. The 4th floor was gutted. No one lived there. No one could live there. I thanked her. I walked back to the elevator. I rode up to my floor and unlocked my door, and stepped into my apartment and did not look at the window. I did not look at the window for 3 hours. When I finally did, when the pull became too strong to resist, when my neck ached from the effort of keeping my head turned away, the apartment across the street was fully furnished. Warm light spilled from a lamp. A figure sat at a desk, typing on a laptop, occasionally reaching for a coffee mug with familiar movements. He looked up. He always looked up, always at the exact moment my gaze found him, as if we were connected by some invisible thread that vibrated when either of us moved. He stood. He walked to his window. He pressed his hand against the glass, palm out, fingers spread. I found my own hand rising, mirror image, inevitable. Our palms met through 40 feet of empty air, and 2 panes of glass that might as well have been the thinnest membrane, the flimsiest barrier between one reality and another. His mouth moved. This time I heard him. Not with my ears. The words arrived somewhere deeper, somewhere more fundamental, somewhere that had been waiting to receive them all along. There is no across. I understood. There is no street. I understood. There is only the window. I looked down. The street was gone. The buildings were gone. There was only darkness below, and above, and all around. Darkness and the window, and the man on the other side who was not on the other side, who had never been on the other side, who was and had always been. I pulled my hand back. I stumbled away from the window. I hit the edge of my desk and felt the sharp pain of impact and clung to that pain like a lifeline, like proof that I still had a body, that I still existed in a world where bodies could feel pain. The notebook was open on my desk. My handwriting covered the page, dense and frantic. Words I didn't remember writing. He is not ahead of you. You are not behind him. You are both falling toward the same point. You have always been falling. The window is not between you. The window is you. The window is... The rest of the page was blank. Not empty. Blank. As if the words had been erased, or had never existed, or were waiting to be written by a hand that hadn't arrived yet. I closed the notebook. I closed my eyes. I listened to my own breathing and tried to remember what it felt like to be certain of anything. Certain that I was real, that the world was real, that the man in the window was something other than a warning, or a memory, or a future I was already living. When I opened my eyes, morning light was streaming through the window. My neck was stiff. My back ached. I had fallen asleep at my desk, cheek pressed against the closed notebook, drool staining the cover. I looked across the street. The apartment was empty, under construction. Plastic sheets covered the windows, rippling slightly in some unfelt breeze. No furniture, no lamp, no figure at a desk. I laughed. The sound was brittle and strange in the silent apartment. I laughed until my throat hurt, until tears streamed down my face, until I couldn't tell if I was laughing or sobbing or something in between. Then I saw the plastic sheet move, not rippling, pressing outward. The shape of a hand, palm flat, fingers spread, pushing against the plastic from the inside, reaching for me. That was 3 days ago, or 3 weeks, or 3 hours. Time has become unreliable, a suggestion rather than a measurement. I've stopped looking at clocks. I've stopped looking at calendars. I've stopped looking at anything except the window and the shape that presses against the plastic, patient and waiting. The binoculars are in my hand. I don't remember picking them up. I don't remember a lot of things anymore. But I remember him. I remember his face, which is my face, which might be the only face that has ever existed. I'm going to look through the binoculars one more time. I'm going to see what's really there. Behind the plastic, behind the window, behind the thin membrane that separates one version of reality from another. I'm going to see if he's still ahead of me, or if we've finally arrived at the same moment, the same point, the same inevitable collision that has been waiting for us since the first morning I looked up and saw my own life reflected back at me from 40 feet away. The plastic is pressing outward. A hand is visible now, pressing through, emerging, reaching. I raise the binoculars. I focus. And the face behind the plastic, finally clear after all this time, finally visible in perfect detail. It's not looking at me. It's looking at something behind me. Its eyes widen in recognition. Its mouth opens in warning. And somewhere in the apartment that I can no longer feel around me, somewhere in the reality that might have been a dream or a premonition or a memory of something that hasn't happened yet, I hear breathing, not mine, close, right behind me. I do not turn around. I keep my eyes on the window. I watch myself watching myself, and I wait for the moment when the gap finally closes, when ahead and behind become the same thing, when the window stops being a barrier and becomes a door. The breathing grows louder. The hand keeps reaching. And I understand finally that I was never the one watching. I was always the one being watched. The window was never across the street. The window was inside me all along. Story 6. The pager went off at 2:47 a.m. I stared at it for a long moment, watching the green glow of its screen pulse against the darkness of the security booth. The device was ancient, one of those chunky institutional models from the early 90s, the kind that hospitals stopped using a decade ago. The hiring manager had handed it to me with an apologetic shrug, explaining that the budget for this place had dried up long before anyone thought to upgrade the equipment. Code blue. Room 7, 11-4. I read the message 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. This was my first night at the old Millbrook General, a sprawling brick complex that had been shuttered for nearly 5 years now. The town's population had halved since the steel plant closed, and the hospital had followed the exodus of bodies and paychecks into obsolescence. There were no patients here, no doctors, No nurses running codes. Just me, a folding chair, and 7 floors of empty corridors. I'd taken the job because the pay was decent and my options weren't. 12 years as an ER nurse had left me with a bad back, worse knees, and a growing suspicion that I'd chosen the wrong profession. When the factory closure swept through town like a plague, the regional hospital consolidated, and suddenly there were 3 nurses for every open position. Security work wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. The pager buzzed again in my palm. Code blue, room 7. 11-4, respond immediately. My throat tightened. I told myself it was a glitch, some ancient circuit firing randomly in the bowels of the building, sending ghost signals through corroded wires. The explanation made perfect sense. It didn't explain why my hands were trembling as I reached for the flashlight. The main corridor stretched before me like the throat of some enormous beast, ceiling tiles missing in patches that revealed the dark intestinal tangle of pipes and wiring above. My footsteps echoed against the linoleum, each sound multiplying in the emptiness until it seemed like a crowd of people walked behind me. I didn't look back. Looking back never helps. The elevator was out of service, had been since the closure, so I took the stairs. Each landing was marked with a large painted number, the paint peeling and bubbled with age. 3rd floor, 4th, 5th. By the time I reached the 7th floor, I was breathing hard, and not just from the climb. The air up here felt different, thicker. It pressed against my skin like wet cloth, carrying a smell I recognized from my years in the ER, the sharp antiseptic bite of industrial cleaner failing to mask something organic underneath. Something wrong. The hallway was identical to the others I'd passed. Institutional green walls, fluorescent light fixtures hanging dark and dead, doors spaced at regular intervals. But something was off. The numbers didn't match what I'd seen on the building schematics during my orientation. Room 701, 703, 705. The odd numbers climbed steadily, but then I saw it. Room 714. The door was closed, its surface unremarkable, the same faded wood as all the others, the same small window set at eye level. But the room number was painted in black digits that looked fresher than anything else in this building, as if someone had touched them up recently. I pressed my face to the window and saw nothing but darkness. My hand found the doorknob before my brain gave permission. The metal was ice cold, almost painful to touch. I turned it anyway. The door opened onto a corridor, not a room, not a patient bed, not monitoring equipment, not even empty space. A narrow hallway, perhaps 3 feet wide, extended into blackness beyond the reach of my flashlight. The walls were bare concrete, unpainted, sweating with moisture that gleamed in the light like something alive. This was wrong. This was impossible. I'd studied the building plans. The 7th floor was a standard patient ward, individual rooms branching off a central corridor. There was no space for additional hallways, no structural support for hidden passages. Yet here it was. I stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot. I spun, grabbed the handle and found it wouldn't turn. The lock, there shouldn't have been a lock on this side, held fast. I took a breath, then another. Panic wouldn't help. Panic never helps. The only way out was forward. The corridor seemed to stretch as I walked, the concrete walls pressing closer with each step. My flashlight carved a tunnel of visibility through the darkness, but the beam felt weaker here, as if the shadows were somehow denser, more resistant to light. I counted my steps, 30, 50, 100, and still the passage continued. Then I heard it. A sound, distant but distinct, the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor. I stopped walking. The beeping continued, steady and mechanical, the sound that had scored 1,000 of my nightmares. Code blues, flat lines, the moment when a heart stops and everything becomes a race against biology. I knew that sound like I knew my own heartbeat, but there were no patients here, no monitors, no hearts to stop. I moved toward the sound anyway. What else could I do? The corridor opened suddenly into a space that made no architectural sense. A room. A patient room. perfectly preserved as if the hospital had never closed. A bed sat in the center, sheets crisp and white under the harsh fluorescent light that buzzed overhead. The cardiac monitor stood beside it, its screen displaying a steady rhythm. Green line rising, falling, rising again. The bed was empty, but the sheets were warm. I touched them without thinking, and the heat against my fingertips sent a shock through my system that bordered on electric. Someone had been here. Someone had been here moments ago. I looked around the room, searching for another door, another corridor, any explanation for the impossible warmth radiating from those sheets. The pager buzzed. Patient missing. Room 7114. Check stairwell B. I didn't remember a stairwell B. The building plans had shown only 2 stairwells, both labeled with letters from the normal alphabet. But when I turned toward the door I'd entered through, I saw another door on the opposite wall, one that hadn't been there before. A small sign above it read, Stairwell B, in letters that seemed to swim and shift when I looked at them directly. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop, to turn back, to find the original corridor and pound on that locked door until my hands bled. But 12 years in emergency medicine had taught me something about instincts. They're often wrong. They tell you to freeze when you should run, to panic when you should think. I couldn't trust my instincts anymore. I wasn't sure I could trust anything. I opened the door to stairwell B. The stairs descended into darkness, spiraling downward in a way that shouldn't have been possible given the building's structure. I counted the floors as I went. 1, 2, 3. But the numbers on the landing walls didn't match my count. After what should have been the ground floor, the stairs continued. Sub-basement 1, sub-basement 2, sub-basement 3. There were no sub-basements in Millbrook General. I'd checked the plans. I'd walked the building during daylight orientation. The lowest level was a standard basement housing mechanical equipment and storage. Nothing below that but dirt and rock and the bones of the earth. Yet here I was, descending into impossible depths, the air growing colder with each step, the walls closer, the darkness deeper. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then died completely. I shook it, slapped it against my palm, but it stayed dead. The darkness was absolute. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in air that tasted of copper and age, listening to the silence press against my eardrums like physical weight. Then slowly, I became aware that the silence wasn't complete. Something was breathing in the darkness with me. Not the quick, panicked rhythm of my own lungs. This was different. Slow, deep, deliberate. The breath of something large and patient. Something that had been waiting in this darkness for a very long time. I wanted to run. Every cell in my body demanded flight, but I couldn't see the stairs, couldn't judge the distance, couldn't trust that running wouldn't send me tumbling into whatever void lay below. So I stood perfectly still, and I listened, and I waited for something to happen. The pager lit up. In the absolute darkness, that tiny green screen was blinding. I squinted against it, raising the device to read the message, and the glow revealed something that made my stomach lurch. Hands, dozens of hands, pressed flat against the walls of the stairwell, fingers splayed, skin pale as marble. They didn't move. They didn't reach for me. They simply waited there, embedded in the concrete as if they'd grown from it, surrounding me on all sides, above and below, a forest of frozen flesh. Patient located. Return to station. The message pulsed on the screen, and as I watched, the hands began to withdraw. Slowly, silently, they sank back into the walls, leaving behind only smooth concrete, as if they'd never been there at all. The darkness seemed to lighten somehow, and I realized I could see the faintest outline of stairs leading upward. I climbed. I don't know how long it took. Time had become elastic in that place, stretching and compressing in ways that made minutes feel like hours and hours like heartbeats. But eventually, I emerged through a door that opened onto a corridor I recognized, the main hallway of the 7th floor, the same institutional green, the same dead fluorescent fixtures. Room 714 was gone. I walked the entire length of the hallway twice, counting doors, checking numbers, The sequence jumped from 713 to 715 with no gap, no space where another room could have existed. The concrete walls showed no seams, no evidence of recent construction or demolition. The room had simply never been there. I made my way back to the security booth on unsteady legs. The folding chair waited where I'd left it, the ancient coffee in my thermos still lukewarm. According to my watch, only 23 minutes had passed since the first page. I sat down. I tried to think. The rational part of my mind, the part that had survived 12 years of trauma and loss and medical impossibility, insisted that I'd experienced some kind of episode. Stress-induced hallucination, sleep deprivation, the beginning of a breakdown I should have seen coming years ago. The explanation was neat, clinical, professional. It was exactly the kind of thing I would have told a patient who described seeing impossible things. But the explanation didn't account for the dirt under my fingernails, gray concrete dust that hadn't been there before. It didn't explain the cold that still clung to my skin, or the faint outline of fingers I could see forming in the frost on the booth's window, pressing from the outside like something trying to get in. The pager sat silent on the desk in front of me. I stared at it, waiting for it to buzz again, dreading the message that might appear. The green screen reflected my face, distorted and pale, and for a moment I thought I saw something else behind me. A shape, a presence, a suggestion of movement in the darkness beyond the booth's windows. I didn't turn around. The shift ended at 6 a.m. I gathered my things, clocked out at the main entrance, and stepped into a gray dawn that felt thin and insubstantial, like waking from a fever dream. The parking lot was empty except for my car, its windshield pearled with dew, its interior exactly as I'd left it. I should have quit. Any sane person would have quit. But sanity felt like a foreign concept now, a word that had lost its meaning sometime during the night. Instead, I drove home, showered, and slept the dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted. When I woke, I found the pager on my nightstand. I hadn't brought it home. I was certain I'd left it in the security booth. I remembered placing it on the desk, remembered the conscious decision not to touch it again. Yet here it was, its screen dark and silent, waiting. I picked it up, and the weight of it felt wrong, heavier than before, as if something had been added to its mechanism, some new component that hadn't been there when I started my shift. The casing was warm against my palm, pulsing with a heat that matched the rhythm of my heart. The screen flickered to life. Welcome back. Your shift begins at 11 p.m. Room 714 is waiting. I stared at the message until the screen went dark again. Then I set the pager down very carefully and walked to the window. Outside, the morning light was ordinary and pale, the street quiet, the neighbor's houses unchanged. Everything looked exactly as it should. But in the reflection of the glass, I could see them now, the hands. Faint impressions against the walls of my bedroom, barely visible, patient, and still. They hadn't followed me home. They'd always been here, waiting in the walls, waiting in the spaces between spaces. I had 11 hours until my next shift. I spent them sitting very still, watching the walls, counting the fingers that appeared and disappeared in my peripheral vision like something testing the boundaries of the visible world. Sometimes I could convince myself they weren't real, just shadows, just tricks of light and exhausted neurons. Sometimes I was almost certain, but certainty, I was learning, was just another kind of darkness. And in the darkness, anything could be waiting. At 10:45 p.m., I picked up the pager and drove back to Millbrook General. The building rose against the night sky like a monument to abandonment, its windows dark, its corridors empty. Or so I told myself. The security booth waited, the folding chair in its familiar position, the coffee thermos right where I'd left it. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was completely, terribly wrong. I sat down. I waited. At 2:47 a.m., the pager went off. Code blue, room 714. And this time, I knew the way. Story 7. The fluorescent lights flickered twice before I opened my eyes. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment I was staring at my reflection in the dark window, watching the familiar suburban landscape blur past, strip malls, parking lots, the skeletal frames of new construction, and the next I was waking to absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels manufactured, deliberate, as if someone had reached into the world and simply turned off the sound. The train car was empty, not just empty of passengers, empty in a way that felt wrong, hollowed out. The usual detritus of commuter life, forgotten newspapers, coffee cups, crumpled receipts, had vanished. The seats stretched out before me in perfect rows, their blue fabric pristine, untouched, as if no one had ever sat in them, as if no one ever would. I checked my phone. The screen displayed 7:47 p.m., frozen. The battery icon showed 63%, but when I tapped the home button, nothing responded. The time remained fixed, suspended in a moment that refused to move forward. Outside the windows, there was only fog. Not the kind that rolls in from the coast or settles in valleys on cold mornings. This was something thicker, more intentional. A wall of gray-white nothing pressed against the glass like a living thing. I couldn't see tracks, couldn't see platform lights, couldn't even tell if we were moving. The gentle vibration beneath my feet suggested motion. But motion toward what? Away from what? I stood, gripping the metal pole for balance, though the car felt eerily stable. No swaying, no rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, just that low, almost subliminal hum, like blood pulsing through my own ears. The announcement came without warning, a chime, 3 ascending notes that felt familiar yet wrong, like hearing your name pronounced by someone who learned it from reading rather than listening, and then a voice. It was female, automated, the same generic transit voice I'd heard thousands of times. But the words weren't right. Next stop, exhaustion. Please watch the gap between the platform and your expectations. I stood frozen, my hand tightening on the pole. The metal was cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that burns after prolonged contact. I let go, flexing my fingers, watching the white marks fade slowly from my palm. Exhaustion. The word settled into my chest like something swallowed wrong. I thought about the last few months, the deadlines that multiplied like cells dividing, the emails that arrived at 3 a.m. with the word urgent bolded, the way my wife's voice had started to sound distant even when she was sitting across the dinner table. The way I'd started taking the later train just to have 40 minutes of silence before facing the house, before facing her questions about whether I was okay, whether we were okay, questions I didn't know how to answer because answering would require a kind of self-examination I'd been avoiding for years. The train slowed, or at least I felt something that suggested deceleration, a subtle shift in the vibration, a change in the quality of the silence. Through the fog, I glimpsed something that might have been a platform, a suggestion of edges and surfaces. But when I pressed my face to the glass, the condensation from my breath revealed nothing but more gray. The doors didn't open. The train accelerated again, smooth and silent, carrying me deeper into wherever this was. I started walking toward the front of the car. The emergency intercoms were spaced every few seats, red buttons marked with instructions I'd never bothered to read. I pressed one, held it, listened to nothing but the hollow feedback of an empty line. The connecting door at the end of the car was standard issue. Glass panel, metal handle, the same design I'd pushed through 100 times to find a less crowded car, or escape the volume of someone's headphones bleeding tinny bass. I pushed through now, stepping into the vestibule between cars, that narrow space of articulated metal and rubber seals where the floor shifts beneath your feet and the noise of the tracks rises up around you. Except there was no noise. And when I opened the door to the next car, I found myself looking at the exact same seats I'd just left. The same blue fabric, the same pristine condition, the same fog pressing against the same windows. But there was someone sitting in the third row. He was turned away from me, shoulders hunched forward, head bowed as if studying something in his lap. He wore a charcoal suit, the fabric rumpled in a way that suggested a long day. His hair was dark, slightly too long, curling at the collar where he'd been meaning to get a haircut for weeks. I recognized the suit. I recognized the hair. I recognized the posture because I'd been told 100 times to sit up straighter, to stop hunching like I was trying to disappear into myself. The man turned toward the door. I stepped backward, stumbling over my own feet, and the door swung shut between us. Through the glass panel, I watched myself, him, settle back into the seat, facing forward again, as if nothing had happened. As if I wasn't standing 3 feet away, my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape. The announcement chimed. Next stop, regret. Connections available to resentment and self-doubt. I didn't move. I couldn't. The vestibule felt smaller than before, the walls pressing inward, the rubber seals between cars groaning with a sound like strained breathing. My reflection in the door's glass showed a face I almost didn't recognize. Pale, tight around the eyes, the look of someone who'd seen something they couldn't explain and was trying very hard not to think about what it meant. When the train slowed again, the fog outside shifted, and for a moment, I saw something. Not a platform, but a shape. Tall, angular, watching. It was there for less than a second before the gray swallowed it again, but the impression lingered. A figure standing in the nothing, waiting. I turned and walked back through the door I'd entered. The car was exactly as I'd left it, but now there were 2 of me sitting in it. One in the 3rd row, still hunched forward, another near the back, leaning against the window with his eyes closed, his mouth slightly open in the slack expression of deep sleep. I knew that face. I'd seen it reflected in dark windows during the morning commute, in bathroom mirrors I was too tired to really look into, in photographs my wife had stopped bothering to take because I was never really present even when I was there. Neither of them looked at me. I pressed myself against the far wall, edging along the seats, keeping my eyes on both figures. The one in the 3rd row hadn't moved. The sleeping one's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that matched my own breathing. Our bodies synchronized in a way that felt obscene. Think. The last thing I remembered clearly was the stop at Westbrook Junction, the usual crowd of commuters shuffling off into the evening. I'd had my eyes closed, not sleeping, just resting, trying to quiet the noise in my head. My manager's voice insisting the quarterly report needed revisions. My wife asking if I'd remembered to call the insurance company. The credit card bill I'd hidden in my desk drawer because looking at it made my stomach clench. When had the car emptied? When had I crossed over into this? The announcement came again, but this time the voice was different, deeper, more personal. It knew me. Now approaching, the things you should have said. This is a limited express. No return service available. I broke into a run. The connecting door at the back of the car. I'd use that one. I'd push through and keep going until I found something that made sense. A conductor, another passenger, anything. The handle resisted for a moment before giving way, and I burst through into the vestibule, the articulated floor shifting beneath me as I reached for the next door. It opened onto the same car. 3 of me now. The 3rd one was standing, his back to me, staring out the fog-covered window. His hands were pressed flat against the glass, and I could see the fog reaching back, tendrils of gray curling around his fingers like something alive, something hungry. I screamed at him to stop, but my voice came out wrong, distant, muted, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me at all. The seated versions remained motionless, waiting. I ran again, back through the door, across the vestibule, but my hand stopped on the handle. I knew what I would find. Another car, another duplicate, another fragment of myself waiting to be discovered. The train was folding in on itself. Or maybe I was folding in on myself, collapsing into layers of who I'd been, and who I was becoming and who I was trying not to be. The fog outside was thicker now, pressing against the windows with visible weight. The glass creaked. I sank into the nearest seat, pulling my knees to my chest, making myself small. The announcement chimed. Next stop, everything you've been avoiding. Please have your explanations ready for inspection. The lights flickered. In the darkness between flashes, I heard something. Breathing that wasn't mine, footsteps in the adjacent car, the slow scrape of fabric against fabric as something moved closer. When the lights stabilized, the third row version of me was looking directly at me. His eyes were wrong. Not the color. Those were my eyes, the same muddy hazel I'd inherited from my father. But something behind them was different. Hollow, patient, like a house with the windows lit but no one home, or a home where something other than people had taken up residence. He smiled. It was the smile I used in meetings when I didn't want to argue anymore, when I just wanted the conversation to end so I could retreat into the safety of my own thoughts. Seeing it from the outside, I understood why my wife had started flinching when I did it. The other two versions were looking at me now as well. The sleeping one had opened his eyes without otherwise moving, and the one at the window had turned from his contemplation of the fog. 3 pairs of eyes, my eyes, watching me from different angles of the car. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. I knew what they were thinking because I was the one thinking it. All the questions I'd stopped asking myself. All the answers I'd buried under work and routine and the comfortable numbness of exhaustion. When did you stop trying? When did you start pretending that this was enough? When did you decide that sleepwalking through your life was preferable to being awake in it? The train slowed again, and this time the fog parted just enough to reveal something on the platform. Not a figure, a mirror, massive, stretching from floor to ceiling, its surface rippling like disturbed water. In it, I could see the interior of the car reflected back at me, but the reflection was wrong. In the mirror, I was alone. No duplicates, no copies, just me, sitting in an empty car, staring at my own terrified face. The doors opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of something I couldn't name. Old paper, copper, the particular mustiness of rooms that haven't been opened in years. The fog swirled on the platform, and the mirror's surface continued its gentle undulation, beckoning. The 3 other versions of me stood simultaneously. They began walking toward the doors, their movements synchronized, their eyes still fixed on me. The one from the 3rd row paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. He spoke. His voice was my voice, but flattened, stripped of inflection. "You can stay on the train." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same emotional vacancy I'd perfected over years of avoiding conversations I didn't want to have. "You can stay on the train forever. Just keep running between cars. Keep finding more of us. Eventually you won't remember which one was first. Eventually it won't matter." The other 2 stepped off onto the platform, walking toward the mirror without hesitation. The fog closed around them immediately, erasing them from sight. The 3rd one, the smiling one, waited. "Or you can get off here. Look at what we've been showing you. Decide if you want to keep being this." The doors chimed their warning. 3 ascending notes. "Doors closing. Please stand clear." I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs had stopped obeying me. My hands were gripping the armrests so hard I could feel the bones of my fingers grinding against each other. The version of me on the platform watched without expression as the doors began to slide shut. At the last possible moment, my body acted without my permission. I lunged forward, throwing myself through the narrowing gap, tumbling onto the platform in a graceless heap. The doors closed behind me with a sound like a sigh. The train began to pull away. Through the windows, I could see the interior of the car, empty again, pristine, waiting for its next passenger. But just before the fog swallowed it completely, I saw a figure in the 3rd row. New. Different. Me, as I had been this morning, adjusting my tie in the dark reflection of the window, already dreading the day ahead. Then it was gone. I stood alone on the platform. The fog pressed in from all sides, and the mirror loomed before me, its surface now still, showing me exactly what I was, a man who had been running between cars of his own life for years, finding only diminished versions of himself at every turn. A man who had accumulated so many copies of his own avoidance that he'd lost track of which one was real. The mirror's surface rippled once, and I saw something beneath the reflection, not a different image, but a depth, layers upon layers of possibility waiting to be acknowledged or ignored. Behind me in the fog, I heard the sound of another train approaching. I didn't turn around. I couldn't stop looking at my own reflection, at the question forming in my eyes that I'd spent so long refusing to ask. The approaching train grew louder, closer. The mirror waited, and somewhere in the fog, I heard the announcement one final time. The words clear despite the distance, intimate as a whisper. Final destination. Yourself. Estimated time of arrival. The rest of your life. No transfers available. I stood there, suspended between the train that would carry me back into the endless loop and the mirror that demanded I finally stop moving. The fog breathed around me. I still haven't decided which way to turn. I woke up gasping in my seat as the train lurched to a stop at Westbrook Junction, the familiar platform lights cutting through the evening darkness. Passengers shuffled past me toward the doors, ordinary people in ordinary clothes, none of them paying attention to the man in the charcoal suit who was gripping his armrests like he was drowning. My phone showed 7:47 p.m., 63% battery. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of something in the fog rolling in from the coast, a shape that might have been a figure, might have been nothing, standing perfectly still on the far end of the platform. When I blinked, it was gone. But in the window's reflection, just for a moment, I could have sworn I saw myself still sitting there with my eyes closed, still running, still trying to find a car that doesn't lead back to itself. Story 8. In the cabin smelled like someone had just left. That was the first thing I noticed when I pushed open the door. Not the mustiness of abandonment I'd expected, not the staleness of air trapped for months since my uncle's passing. Instead, the place carried the faint warmth of recent occupation, a trace of wood smoke, the ghost of coffee, something almost like breath. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, my duffel bag growing heavy in my grip. The evening light slanted through windows that were far too clean, casting long amber rectangles across floorboards that should have been thick with dust. Everything looked prepared. As if the cabin had been waiting, the lawyer had assured me no one had been here since they'd found my uncle collapsed by the woodpile 3 months ago. Heart attack, sudden and solitary. He'd been dead for nearly a week before anyone thought to check on him. The man had lived like a hermit for the last 15 years of his life, up here in the Colorado mountains, where the nearest neighbor was 7 miles of winding dirt road away. I'd met him exactly twice in my 34 years, once at my grandmother's funeral when I was 11, and once at a family reunion I barely remembered. He was a strange, quiet man who seemed to look through people rather than at them, and now his cabin was mine. I stepped inside and closed the door against the October chill. The main room was smaller than I'd imagined from the exterior, a modest living space with a stone fireplace, a worn leather armchair, a table with 2 chairs that seemed optimistic for a man who never had visitors. A kitchenette occupied one corner, and a narrow hallway led to what I assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. Bookshelves lined every available wall, stuffed with volumes that ranged from philosophy to astronomy, to subjects I couldn't identify from their cracked spines. I dropped my bag by the door and moved through the space, running my fingers along surfaces that came away clean. No dust. The realization sat wrong in my stomach, a small stone of unease I tried to swallow. It's fine, I told myself. The lawyer probably hired someone to clean before my arrival. A reasonable explanation. A normal explanation. I needed normal right now. That was the whole point of coming here, to escape the wreckage of my life back in Denver for a few days. The divorce that had finalized 2 weeks ago. The job I'd quit in a moment of spite I was already regretting. The apartment that echoed with the absence of furniture she'd taken and memories I couldn't. I needed silence and solitude and space to figure out who I was supposed to be now that everything I'd built had collapsed. The irony of seeking that reset in a dead man's cabin wasn't lost on me. I unpacked mechanically, stowing clothes in the bedroom's small dresser, arranging toiletries in a bathroom that featured a clawfoot tub and a mirror that had begun to silver at the edges. The bedroom itself was Spartan, a brass bed with a surprisingly comfortable mattress, a nightstand, a reading lamp, and on the nightstand, a leather-bound journal. It was the kind of thing you'd find in an antique shop. Hand-stitched binding, pages that had yellowed to the color of old teeth, a leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. No title on the spine, no name embossed on the front. Just a simple journal, the sort a man might use to record his thoughts in the lengthening isolation of mountain evenings. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was heavier than it looked. I opened to the first page. The handwriting that greeted me was small and precise, almost architectural in its regularity. And the words stopped my breath in my chest. He arrived at 6:47 p.m., later than he intended. He stood in the doorway for 37 seconds before entering, and his first thought was that the cabin smelled like someone had just left. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me. It fell to the floor with a thud that seemed too loud in the silence. For a long moment I just stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring down at the played pages. A prank. It had to be a prank. Someone, my ex-wife maybe, with her cruel sense of humor, had arranged this somehow, found out I was coming here, broken in, planted this ridiculous prop. The idea was absurd even as I formed it. She didn't know about the cabin. She didn't care enough to engineer something this elaborate. And who could have known exactly when I would arrive? Exactly what I would think. I picked up the journal again, my hands not quite steady, and kept reading. He will tell himself it's a prank. This thought will comfort him for approximately 4 minutes before he reads the next paragraph and realizes I knew he would think that too. The silence of the cabin pressed against my ears like water. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and quick. I could hear the tick of some clock I hadn't noticed, counting seconds in the walls. I could hear the wind beginning to rise outside, brushing against the windows with fingers of pine. He will go to the kitchen next. He will pour himself whiskey from the bottle in the cabinet above the sink, the bottle he doesn't yet know is there, and he will drink it standing up, trying to convince himself that this is all an elaborate coincidence. I walked to the kitchen. My legs carried me there without permission, and my hands, my traitor hands, opened the cabinet above the sink to reveal a bottle of Jameson, 3/4 full, as if someone had been drinking from it recently. I poured 2 fingers into a glass I found hanging from a hook, and I drank it standing up, just as the journal said I would. The whiskey burned going down, but it didn't warm me. I brought the journal back to the kitchen table and sat in the chair that faced the door, the chair that let me see if anyone entered. The light outside was fading now, the amber rectangles on the floor lengthening into bloody strips of sunset. I turned the page. He's afraid now. Not the clean, sharp fear of immediate danger. Nothing so honest as that. This is the slow fear, the creeping kind, the fear of not understanding, of not knowing the rules. He came here to find himself, but he's beginning to suspect that something found him first. I poured more whiskey. The next several pages documented the rest of my evening with unsettling precision. They knew I would eat the can of soup I'd brought, tomato which I'd grabbed at random from my pantry, that I would take it standing by the window watching the darkness pool between the pines. They knew I would check the locks 3 times before settling into the leather armchair with a book I wouldn't actually read. They knew I would fall asleep there instead of the bedroom. The journal clutched to my chest like a child holding a stuffed animal for protection. And they knew I would wake at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of footsteps on the porch. I came awake all at once, my body going rigid in the chair. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in shades of rust and shadow. And outside, yes, outside I could hear it, the slow, deliberate creak of weight on old wood, the measured pace of someone walking the perimeter of the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed, airily. The footsteps circled once, twice, 3 times, each pass seeming to slow, as if whoever was out there was listening just as intently as I was. Then they stopped, right outside the door. Seconds stretched into centuries. The door didn't open. The handle didn't turn. But I heard something else, the faint scratch of something against wood. Writing. Someone was writing on my door. When the sound stopped, the footsteps retreated into the forest. their rhythm fading into the vast silence of the mountains. I sat paralyzed until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows. Only then did I force myself to rise, to cross the room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle. Outside, the porch was empty. The forest stood silent and still, mist rising from the valley below like the breath of sleeping giants. I looked down at the door. Someone had carved a single word into the wood, the letters crude but legible. Closer. I went back inside and found the journal where I'd dropped it during the night. I opened it to where I'd left off, needing to know what came next, dreading what I'd find. He'll find the word closer carved into his door. He'll convince himself it was an animal, or a hiker, or perhaps evidence that he's finally losing his grip on reality entirely. None of these explanations will satisfy him, but he'll pretend they do. Today he'll explore the cabin more thoroughly. He'll find the hidden study. He should find the hidden study. I read those last words 3 times, feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. The phrasing was different. Not a prediction anymore, but a suggestion, an instruction. I didn't want to follow it. Every rational instinct I possessed screamed that I should pack my bag, drive back to Denver, and never think about this place again. Sell it to the first buyer. Let it become someone else's mystery. But I didn't leave. Something kept me rooted to that cabin. Curiosity, perhaps, or the terrible suspicion that running wouldn't help. That whatever was happening would follow me wherever I went. I began to search. The cabin was modest, but it revealed its secrets reluctantly. I knocked on walls, listening for hollow spots. I pulled books from shelves, searching for hidden latches. I examined floorboards, tested windowsills, pressed every knot in every piece of wood I could find. It was in the bedroom closet that I found it, a section of the back wall that gave slightly when I pushed. It swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The rational part of my mind observed that a hidden underground room in a mountain cabin should have been cold, damp, probably full of spiders and rot. Instead, warm air rose from below, carrying with it the smell of paper and ink and something else, something that reminded me of old churches, of spaces where people had whispered to things that might or might not have been listening. I descended. The study was larger than the cabin above it, as if it had been carved from the mountain itself. Shelves stretched into shadows, crammed with more books, more journals, stacks of papers covered in that same precise handwriting. A desk dominated the center of the space, its surface cluttered with pens and inkwells and scattered pages. And on the wall behind the desk, illuminated by a lamp that shouldn't have been burning but was, photographs. Dozens of them. All of me. I approached slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The photos spanned years, decades. There I was as a child, playing in a backyard I barely remembered. There I was as a teenager, smoking behind my high school. There I was on my wedding day, on vacations I'd taken, in offices where I'd worked. The images traced my entire life, moments I hadn't known anyone was watching, captured and preserved in this underground room. And in the corner of each photograph, barely visible, a shadow. A suggestion of a figure standing just outside the frame, always watching, always present. I sank into the chair behind the desk, unable to stand any longer. The journal lay open before me, a different journal, I realized, older than the one upstairs. The handwriting was the same, but the entries dated back decades. He's found the study now. He's seen the photographs, though he hasn't truly understood them yet. He's sitting in my chair, reading my words, and soon he'll begin to grasp the nature of our arrangement. I've been watching him since before he was born. I've been waiting for him to come here, to this cabin, to this room. Everything that has happened in his life, every joy, every loss, every decision that led him to this moment, has been anticipated, recorded, known. He wants to understand. He wants to ask, why me? Why any of this? The answer is simpler than he fears and more terrible than he can imagine, because I needed him to find this journal, because for 34 years, I've been writing his story, and now I need him to continue it. Turn to the last page. My hands moved before I could stop them, rifling through the old journal to find its end. The final entry was dated yesterday, the day before I arrived. He will read this and wonder if he has any choice at all. He'll question whether he's been living his own life or merely following a script written by someone, something he's never understood. The uncertainty will consume him. It should consume him. But here's the truth he's not ready to accept. I am not behind him. I am not watching from the shadows. I have never been separate from him at all. I am what he becomes. I am the man sitting in this chair, 40 years from now, writing the story of his younger self because he finally understands that time is not a line. It is a circle. And I have always been here, guiding him toward this moment. Because without this moment, I would never exist to guide him. He has a choice now. He can close this journal and walk away, and none of this will have happened. Reality will heal around the wound of his visit like water closing over a stone. Or he can pick up the pen. He can begin to write what comes next. And eventually, after years of watching and writing, he'll understand that he's not trapped in this story. He is the story. The choice is his. It always has been. I sat in that underground study as the hours passed, the lamp burning steady, the silence pressing close. Above me, the cabin waited. Outside, the mountains kept their secrets. On the desk before me lay an empty journal, its pages pristine, waiting, and beside it, a pen. I thought about my life, the marriage that had crumbled, the career I'd abandoned, the gnawing sense that I'd been sleepwalking through my own existence for years. I thought about the photographs on the wall, all those moments captured by someone who knew me better than I knew myself. I thought about the footsteps on the porch, the word carved into my door, closer. I picked up the pen, and somewhere, somewhen, a man who might be me, who might always have been me, smiled in the darkness and turned to a fresh page, already knowing what I would write, because he remembered doing this himself, years ago, in a cabin that smelled like someone had just left. The first sentence came easily. He arrived at 6:47 p.m., later than he intended. Story 9. The light never goes off. I noticed it the first night we moved in. Back when I still believed this quiet suburban street was exactly what my therapist meant by a fresh start. The house across from ours, a pale blue colonial with white shutters and an immaculate lawn, glowed from every window like something radioactive. At 2 a.m. when I got up for water, the light was there. At 4 a.m., when the nightmares pushed me out of bed again, it remained unchanged. By dawn, I convinced myself the owner must work night shifts, or perhaps was elderly and afraid of the dark. That was 3 months ago. Now I know better. Now I know that whoever lives in that house doesn't work anywhere, doesn't leave for groceries, doesn't collect their mail until well after midnight when they think no one is watching. But I'm always watching. I can't seem to stop. The mailman confirmed my suspicions during the second week. I caught him at our mailbox, asked casually about the neighbors, the way you do when you're new somewhere and trying to seem normal. He glanced at the blue house and his face did something complicated. Not quite fear, but adjacent to it. He told me the owner had lived there for 11 years, never once answered the door for a package, never waved from the driveway or attended the annual block party. The mail always disappeared from the box, but no one had ever seen it happen. He said the word recluse, the way someone might say tumor, clinical, but heavy with unspoken dread. I thanked him, went back inside, told myself it didn't matter. But that night, around 11:47 p.m., I saw the curtain move. It was subtle, a displacement of fabric no wider than a hand, lasting perhaps 3 seconds. Behind it, I could see nothing but the ambient glow of those eternal lights. Yet I felt something, a pressure against my consciousness like being watched through a one-way mirror. My skin prickled. The hair on my forearms rose as if touched by static electricity. I told myself I was imagining things. The therapist's voice echoed in my head. Hypervigilance is a symptom, not a skill. Not everyone is a threat. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The pattern established itself with mechanical precision. Every night at 11:47, the curtain would part. Every night, I would be watching, unable to look away, trapped in some silent ritual I hadn't consented to join. My wife noticed the changes first, the circles under my eyes, the way I'd drift mid-conversation, always orienting myself toward the front window. She asked if I was taking my medication. I lied and said yes. The truth was more complicated. The pills made me foggy, slow, disconnected from my own perceptions. And I needed my perceptions sharp. I needed to understand what was happening across that street, because the alternative, that nothing was happening, that I was simply unraveling again, was too terrible to accept. I started keeping a journal. Times, observations, the precise duration of each curtain movement. I noted the quality of the light, whether it seemed warmer or cooler, brighter or dimmer. I recorded the weather, the phase of the moon, the ambient noise level of the neighborhood. I told myself this was rational, scientific, not obsession, but investigation. The entries grew longer. The handwriting grew worse. By the 6th week, I had filled 3 notebooks and lost 7 pounds. My wife had stopped asking questions. We moved through the house like ghosts, occupying the same haunting, never quite intersecting. At night, she slept in the guest room. I sat by the window. The curtain kept opening. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays had always been my worst days. Something about the way the week stretched out ahead, infinite and suffocating. I was at the window by 11:30, earlier than usual, my coffee cold in my hands. At 11:47, the curtain parted, but this time, there was something behind it. Not a face. Not exactly. A shape, pale and indistinct, occupying space the way a thought occupies the mind. It was there, and not there, solid and vaporous, present in a way that made my eyes water and my temples throb. I blinked, trying to focus, and when I opened my eyes again, the curtain had closed. But the shape remained. Not across the street, in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of sight, a presence that vanished whenever I turned to look directly at it. I spent the rest of the night chasing shadows through my own house, spinning in circles like a dog pursuing its tail, growing more frantic with each failed attempt to catch whatever was just beyond my perception. By morning, I had made a decision. The walk across the street felt like a journey through deep water. Each step required immense effort, as if the air itself had thickened into something resistant. The blue house loomed larger than it should have, its proportions somehow wrong, its windows reflecting a sky several shades darker than the one above me. I stood on the porch for what might have been minutes or hours. The doorbell was brass, tarnished green at the edges, cold against my fingertip when I finally pressed it. No sound emerged, no footsteps approached. I tried the handle. It turned. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a foyer that smelled of dust and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The lights were on, as always, but they seemed to illuminate nothing, casting a flat, directionless glow that made depth perception impossible. I called out. My voice disappeared into the space like a stone dropped into fog. The house was empty, not abandoned. The furniture was clean, the surfaces free of dust. A half-empty glass of water standing on the kitchen counter as if someone had just stepped away, but there was no one there. No photographs on the walls, no books on the shelves, no signs of habitation beyond the most basic arrangements. It was a house designed to appear lived in, a stage set for a play that had never been performed. I found the security system in the living room. It was mounted on the wall beside the fireplace, a sleek modern panel that seemed jarringly out of place among the traditional furnishings. The screen glowed with the same pale luminescence as the windows, displaying a grid of camera feeds covering every angle of the property. I didn't remember touching it, but suddenly I was scrolling through recordings. Timestamps flickered past. Yesterday, last week, last month. And then something caught my eye, a date I didn't recognize. Tomorrow. The recording showed the front porch, the same view I'd walked through moments ago, and there, climbing the steps, reaching for the door, was me. Same clothes, same hunched posture, same desperate expression I'd seen in the mirror that morning. I scrolled forward. 3 days from now. Me again, this time entering through the back door, moving with a confidence I didn't feel, as if I knew exactly where I was going. A week from now. 2 weeks. A month. Recording after recording, each dated in the future, each showing me entering this house through various doors, at various times, wearing clothes I owned but hadn't yet chosen to wear, displaying expressions I hadn't yet learned to make. In some, I was calm. In others, frantic. In one, dated 6 weeks ahead, I stood in this very room, staring at this very screen, my face twisted into something I didn't want to name. The glass of water on the counter was still sweating condensation, as if freshly poured. I turned to leave. The front door was closed. I didn't remember closing it. The walk back across the street took longer than the walk over. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made my stomach lurch. When I finally reached my own porch, the sun had moved significantly across the sky, though I couldn't have been gone more than 20 minutes. My wife wasn't home. I didn't remember her leaving. I went to the front window and looked across at the blue house. The lights were on, unchanging, eternal. But now I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. A figure in one of the upstairs windows, barely visible behind a gauzy curtain. Watching. It looked familiar. I raised my hand, slowly, experimentally. The figure raised its hand too, not in synchronization. A half-second ahead of me, as if it knew what I was going to do before I did it. As if it was leading, and I was following, trapped in a choreography I hadn't agreed to perform. That night, I didn't go to the window at 11:47. I stayed in bed, blankets pulled to my chin, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but I felt it anyway. The moment of watching, the pressure of attention, the weight of being observed by something that knew me better than I knew myself. The recordings haunt me now. Not because of what they showed, but because of what they implied. Somewhere in that house, on that impossible security system, there exists a complete record of my future. Every visit I will make, every door I will open, every expression that will cross my face in the weeks and months ahead. I've tried to stay away. For 3 days I didn't leave my house, didn't look out the front windows, didn't acknowledge the blue colonial across the street. But on the 4th day, I found myself on that porch again, hand reaching for the door, just as I'd seen myself do in one of the recordings. I was wearing the exact clothes, making the exact expression, fulfilling a prophecy I'd tried to refuse. The recordings were correct. They're always correct. My wife has noticed the changes. She started sleeping elsewhere. Her sister's place, a hotel. I'm not sure anymore. We haven't spoken in days. The house feels emptier, but also more watched, as if her absence has made room for something else to observe me. Last night, at 11:47, I saw myself in that upstairs window. Not a reflection, not imagination. Me, or something wearing my face, standing behind the gauze curtain, hand raised in that same half-second early wave. Watching, waiting, knowing what I would do before I did it. I've checked the security system again. The recordings stretch further now, months into a future I can't comprehend. I see myself doing things I don't understand, carrying objects I don't own, speaking to people I don't recognize, making gestures whose meaning I can't interpret. And in the final recording, dated sometime next spring, I'm no longer entering the house. I'm already inside, standing in the living room, looking out through the front window, watching the house across the street. My house, where a figure paces behind the curtains checking the time, waiting for 11:47, preparing to observe what can never be fully understood. The light in the blue house never goes off. I think I'm beginning to understand why. I think I've always been here, and there, watching and watched, subject and object of the same impossible observation, caught in a loop I didn't create but cannot escape. playing out a script written in a language I'm only beginning to learn. Tonight at 11:47, the curtain will open, and I will be on both sides of the glass. Story 10. The ping came at 3:47 a.m., that dead hour when the city holds its breath and even the streetlights seem to flicker with exhaustion. I had been about to call it a night, 12 hours behind the wheel, my eyes burning, my lower back screaming for the relief of my apartment's sagging mattress. But the surge pricing blinked red on my screen. 3x multiplier, and the pickup was only 4 minutes away. One more ride. Just one more, and I could justify the overtime to myself, to the bills stacked on my kitchen counter like accusations. The address led me toward the industrial district on the eastern edge of the city, past the last functioning warehouses, and into that forgotten geography where businesses come to die. I knew the area vaguely, had picked up a few night shift workers from the meat processing plant that still operated on the far side, had once dropped off a woman at one of the storage facilities who paid entirely in crumpled singles and never met my eyes. But this address was deeper in, past even those landmarks, into blocks I couldn't recall ever driving through despite 5 years working these streets. The GPS guided me down progressively narrower roads. The buildings here were hollow shells, their windows dark mouths gaping at nothing. Graffiti covered the lower walls in layers so thick, the oldest tags had become geological strata, compressed beneath decades of spray paint. No streetlights functioned in this section. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating broken glass that glittered like scattered stars on the asphalt. I found the address, or what should have been the address. The building was a squat concrete structure with no signage, no visible doors on the street-facing side, no indication that anyone had set foot here in years. I checked my phone again. The app showed the passenger waiting, the little icon pulsing with patient certainty. I put the car in park and waited, engine idling, heat blowing against the November cold that had crept through my windows. The clock on my dashboard read 3:52. I would give it 5 minutes. That was the rule I'd made for myself years ago. 5 minutes, then cancel, and move on. No fare was worth sitting alone in the dark, wondering. At 3:54, I glanced in my rearview mirror to check the street behind me. He was already in the back seat. My heart seized. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't felt the subtle shift of weight that comes when someone enters a vehicle. But there he was, sitting directly behind the passenger seat, hands folded in his lap, watching me through the mirror with an expression I couldn't read. He was middle-aged, maybe 50, with gray threading through dark hair and a face that seemed somehow familiar in a way I couldn't place. He wore a dark coat, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd see on 100 men in any downtown crowd. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask how he'd gotten in, when he'd gotten in. But the words dried up in my throat. The man simply nodded, a small gesture that seemed to acknowledge my confusion while dismissing it as irrelevant. He gave me an address. I don't remember exactly what he said now, only that I typed it into the GPS and the app accepted it without hesitation, calculating the route, estimating the fare. 23 minutes. The destination appeared as a point on the map, somewhere north of the city, in a direction I rarely drove. I pulled away from the curb. What else was there to do? He was a passenger. I was a driver. The transaction was already in motion. The streets we traveled should have been familiar. I had driven this city's arteries for half a decade, knew its shortcuts and its bottlenecks, its construction zones and its one-way traps. But the roads the GPS led me down felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The intersections came at unexpected intervals. The buildings that lined the streets were the right general shape, but the wrong specific architecture. A bodega where I remembered a laundromat. A vacant lot where I was certain a church had stood. I told myself I was tired. That exhaustion was playing tricks on my spatial memory. But the unease settled into my stomach like something swallowed whole. The passenger spoke again, his voice soft and conversational, the way you might speak to someone you'd known for years. He mentioned a summer, a specific August, and the heat that had pressed down on the city like a physical weight. He described a boy riding his bicycle down a street lined with maple trees, pedaling so fast his legs burned, racing against nothing but his own desperate need to feel speed, to feel free. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I hadn't thought about that summer in decades. The street with the maples had been torn up for a highway expansion when I was 12. The trees had come down, the houses had been condemned, and my family had moved to a different neighborhood where I knew no one, and spent the rest of my childhood feeling like a stranger in my own life. I asked the passenger how he knew about that. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. Inside, something had begun to vibrate at a frequency just below panic. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he mentioned a dog, a mutt with one ear that flopped and one that stood straight up. A dog I had found behind the grocery store and hidden in my bedroom for 3 days before my father discovered it and made me take it to the shelter. I had never told anyone about the way I cried walking home, about how I had promised myself I would go back for that dog when I was old enough to make my own decisions, and how I never did. The GPS instructed me to turn left onto a street called Meridian Avenue. I turned. The street sign was there, clear in my headlights. But I had never heard of Meridian Avenue. I had never seen it on any map. The road stretched ahead into darkness so complete, my headlights seemed to be swallowed rather than reflected. The passenger continued talking. He described my first apartment after college, the one with the radiator that clanked like chains being dragged across a floor. He mentioned the window that faced the brick wall of the adjacent building, and how I used to lie awake at night counting the bricks I could see in the light from the street, trying to quiet my mind enough to sleep. He knew about the woman I had almost proposed to, the ring I had bought and returned 3 times before finally leaving it in a drawer I never opened. He spoke about my mother's hands in her final weeks, how thin they had become, how I had held them, and felt the bones beneath skin that had turned to paper. These were not things I had shared with anyone. These were the private archives of my own memory, the moments I had locked away in rooms I rarely visited. And yet this stranger in my back seat recited them with the casual familiarity of someone flipping through a photo album they had seen 1,000 times. I checked the rearview mirror again. His face remained placid, almost kind. There was nothing threatening in his posture, nothing aggressive in his tone, and somehow that made it worse. A threat I could understand, a threat I could respond to, but this gentle excavation of my innermost self left me with no framework for reaction. The streets outside had stopped making sense entirely. We passed the same gas station 3 times, its lights flickering in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The buildings grew taller, then shorter, then disappeared entirely, leaving stretches of empty field that shouldn't exist within city limits. The GPS continued to guide me, its confident voice directing me through a geography that obeyed rules I didn't recognize. I tried to pull over. I pressed my foot to the brake, and the car slowed, but when I attempted to turn the wheel toward the curb, my hands simply wouldn't cooperate. Or perhaps there was no curb to turn toward. The edges of the road had become indistinct, bleeding into shadow that might have been sidewalk, or might have been void. The passenger began talking about my father. Not the broad strokes I might have mentioned in casual conversation, but the specific textures of memory I had never articulated even to myself. The way he smelled of machine oil and cigarettes after work. The particular timbre of his voice when he was disappointed, how it dropped half an octave and went quiet instead of loud. The night I found him sitting alone in the garage at 2 a.m, staring at nothing, and how I had stood in the doorway for 10 minutes before retreating to my bed without speaking, because I was 17 and had no language for the kind of pain I saw in his face. I asked the passenger who he was. This time I didn't manage to keep my voice steady. He leaned forward slightly, close enough that I could see his reflection more clearly in the mirror. His eyes, I noticed now, were not quite the same color, one slightly darker than the other, a detail that seemed important, though I couldn't say why. He told me he was no one. He told me he was everyone. He told me he was the accumulated weight of every moment I had tried to forget, every choice I had made and unmade, every version of myself I had abandoned on the road to becoming who I was now. The GPS announced that we would arrive at our destination in 4 minutes. I looked at the map on my phone. The route we had taken was displayed as a blue line, but the line curved back on itself in impossible ways, forming loops and spirals that no actual journey could have traced. The destination marker pulsed ahead. but the streets shown around it were labeled with names I didn't recognize. Names that felt less like words than like the memory of words. Sounds that slipped away from meaning, even as I tried to read them. The passenger resumed his quiet monologue. He spoke about the accident I had almost caused 3 years ago, when I had run a red light at an intersection I had passed 1,000 times, and somehow missed seeing the crossing traffic until the blare of horns snapped me back to awareness. I had pulled over a block later and sat shaking for 20 minutes, thinking about how close I had come to ending not just my life, but the lives of strangers I would never meet. I had never told anyone about that moment, had pushed it down into the same locked room where I kept all the things too heavy to carry into daylight. He knew about the lie I had told my sister, the one that had fractured something between us that was never fully repaired. He knew about the money I had stolen from a roommate in my 20s and never confessed. He knew about the thoughts I had late at night when sleep wouldn't come, the dark arithmetic I sometimes performed, adding up the weight of my failures against whatever modest achievements I could claim. The clock on my dashboard now read 3:52, the same time it had shown when I first noticed him in my back seat. I had been driving for what felt like an hour, but time itself seemed to have become as unreliable as geography. The GPS instructed me to turn right onto my own street. I turned, and there it was. The apartment building where I had lived for 7 years, its brick facade familiar in my headlights, the broken window on the 3rd floor that the landlord kept promising to fix, the dumpster in the alley that always overflowed by Thursday. We were back in my neighborhood, though I had no memory of crossing the boundary between the impossible roads and the real ones. The passenger told me to pull over. His voice had changed, deepened into something that resonated in my chest rather than my ears. I obeyed. The car stopped in front of my building. The engine continued to idle. The heater continued to blow warm air. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for the man sitting behind me, except for the 30 impossible minutes we had just spent traversing a city that didn't exist. He leaned closer still, his breath fogging the side of my face. Cold, far colder than the heated interior of the car should have allowed. He asked me if I remembered now. He asked if I understood what I had been running from all these years, all these miles, all these late nights spent carrying strangers through darkness to avoid sitting alone with my own thoughts. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed around something too large to swallow. He reached forward and placed his hand on my shoulder. The touch was ice through the fabric of my jacket, a cold so profound it felt almost like burning. He told me that some fares never really end. He told me that some passengers are always waiting in the back seat, patient and quiet, riding along on every journey we take. He told me that the destination I was trying to reach didn't exist on any map, because I had been driving in circles my whole life, avoiding roads that would have led me somewhere real. The GPS screen went dark. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. I sat there for a long time, watching the clock on my dashboard cycle through minutes that seemed to arrive at normal intervals once again. The city was silent around me, that held breath quiet of the deepest night. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt the tension drain from my muscles. Should have laughed at myself for letting exhaustion and isolation conjure phantoms from nothing. But when I finally turned off the engine and stepped out of my car, I noticed the footprints in the thin frost that had formed on the sidewalk. 2 sets, one leading from my driver's door to the entrance of my building, and one leading from my rear passenger door into the alley beside the dumpster, disappearing into shadows that seemed thicker than they should have been. I checked my phone. The ride had been completed, the fare collected, the rating submitted. 5 stars. And in the notes section, where passengers sometimes left comments, there was a single line of text. See you next time. I haven't driven since. I keep telling myself I'll go back to it, that bills don't pay themselves, that what happened was just a symptom of burnout and bad sleep and too many hours alone in the dark. But every time I reach for my keys, I find myself glancing at the back seat first, searching for a shape that might already be waiting. Sometimes late at night, I hear a car idling outside my window. When I look, the street is empty, but the sound continues, patient as memory, until I close my eyes and pretend to sleep. Story 11. The exit appeared where no exit should have been. I had driven this stretch of Interstate 84 dozens of times over the past 3 years, mapping every rest stop and gas station in my mind like a trucker memorizing his routes. Mile marker 142 came after a gentle curve, followed by nothing but flat farmland until the truck stop at mile 158. That was the geography I knew. That was the geography that had always existed, but exhaustion has a way of rewriting maps. The green sign materialized in my headlights at 11:47 p.m. I remember the time because I had just checked my phone, calculating how many more hours until I could collapse into a bed somewhere. Exit 147, it read, and beneath it, lodging, 2 miles. The paint looked faded, the reflective coating peeling at the edges, and I told myself that explained why I had never noticed it before. Signs get replaced, routes get updated, nothing strange about that. I took the exit. The off-ramp curved sharper than I expected, my sedan's tires protesting against the worn asphalt. There were no streetlights here, no illuminated billboards advertising fast food or cheap motels, just the narrow beam of my headlights cutting through October darkness and the skeletal shapes of trees pressing close on either side of the road. 2 miles, the sign had promised. I watched my odometer tick upward. 1 mile, then 2, then 3, and still there was nothing but that empty road unwinding before me. I was about to turn around to admit defeat and find my way back to the interstate when the building appeared. The Wayside Inn sat at the end of a gravel parking lot like something that had always been there, waiting. A 2-story structure with a long wooden porch running its entire length, painted in what might have once been white, but had weathered to the color of old bone. A neon sign flickered in one of the ground floor windows. Vacancy. The letters buzzing with that particular electric hum that seems to exist only in places time has forgotten. I parked in front of the office, my car the only vehicle in a lot that could have held 30. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I stepped out, and I became suddenly aware of the silence. No crickets, no distant highway noise, no wind moving through those skeletal trees. Just the buzzing of that neon sign and the sound of my own breathing, loud in my ears. The woman behind the front desk looked up as I entered, and something in her face, some quality I couldn't quite name, made me hesitate in the doorway. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes the color of faded denim. She smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach those pale eyes. She asked if I needed a room, and I told her I did, just for one night. She nodded as if she had expected nothing less, sliding a leather-bound guest book across the counter toward me. The pages were yellowed, the binding cracked with age, and as I signed my name, I noticed the entries above mine. A dozen names, perhaps more, all dated within the past week. The handwriting varied, some neat, some hurried, some barely legible, but they all shared a strange quality I couldn't identify until I had finished writing my own name and stepped back. None of them had listed a departure date. The woman handed me a brass key attached to a wooden tag, carved with the number 7. "Second floor," she told me, "end of the hall." She mentioned that breakfast would be available in the morning, though she didn't specify a time. I thanked her, and as I turned to leave, I caught her reflection in the window behind the counter. She was still smiling, but her eyes, those faded denim eyes, were following me with an intensity that made something cold settle in my stomach. I told myself I was tired. I told myself that 3 days of back-to-back sales meetings had left me seeing shadows where none existed. I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway stretched before me, longer than it had appeared from outside. Doors lined both walls, each one identical. Dark wood, brass numbers, and those old-fashioned keyholes that made me think of Victorian novels and secrets locked away in attics. The carpet beneath my feet was red, or had been once, now faded to the color of dried rust. It muffled my footsteps as I walked, creating an unsettling sensation of moving through the space without actually touching it. Room 7 waited at the end of the hall, just as the woman had said. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung inward to reveal a space that was ordinary. A double bed with a white coverlet, a wooden dresser with a mirror, a small bathroom visible through a half-open door. Everything clean, everything in its proper place, everything exactly as a roadside hotel room should be. I set my overnight bag on the dresser and caught my reflection in the mirror. A tired man in a rumpled suit, dark circles under his eyes, 3 days of stubble on his chin. The face staring back at me looked older than I remembered, but that was just the lighting, just the exhaustion. I turned away before I could examine that thought too closely. The bed was comfortable, the sheets crisp and cool against my skin. I lay in the darkness listening to the silence of the building around me and waited for sleep to come. It didn't. At first, I attributed my insomnia to the unfamiliarity of the space, the way the shadows fell differently than they did in my apartment, the absence of city sounds I had grown accustomed to. But as the hours crept past, midnight, then 1, then 2, I became aware of something else. Something wrong. The hotel was too quiet. I had counted at least a dozen names in that guest book, all dated within the past week, none with departure dates. Yet I heard nothing from the rooms around me. No footsteps in the hallway, no muffled conversations through thin walls, no television murmurs or running water or creaking bed springs, just silence, thick and absolute, pressing against my eardrums like something physical. I got up. I couldn't help myself. The hallway was empty when I opened my door, the rust-colored carpet stretching in both directions, the identical doors standing like sentries in the dim light of fixtures that seemed to flicker at the edge of perception. I walked to the room next to mine, number 6, and pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I moved to number 5, number 4, number 3. Each door greeted me with the same profound silence, and with each one, that cold feeling in my stomach grew stronger. I found myself standing before room number 1, at the opposite end of the hall from my own, my hand raised to knock, and then I stopped, because I realized I could hear something after all. Breathing, not from behind the door, but from behind me. Slow, measured breaths, perfectly synchronized with my own, as if something was standing just over my shoulder, matching my rhythm exactly. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the hallway was empty. The doors stood closed. The carpet stretched away toward the staircase, undisturbed. I returned to my room. I locked the door. I pushed the dresser against it, the wooden legs scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in all that silence. And then I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the door, waiting for something that never came. I must have slept eventually, because the next thing I knew, gray morning light was filtering through the curtains, and the clock on the bedside table read 7:23 a.m. The dresser was still against the door. The room was still empty. Everything was exactly as I had left it, and in the pallid light of day, my fears from the night before seemed almost ridiculous. Almost. I showered quickly, dressed in the same rumpled suit. I hadn't bothered to pack a change of clothes for such a short trip, and moved the dresser back to its proper place. The mirror showed me the same tired face, but somehow the shadows under my eyes seemed darker, the lines around my mouth more pronounced. I looked away and gathered my bag. The hallway was empty. The stairs were empty. The lobby was empty when I descended. The front desk unattended, the leather-bound guest book closed and sitting exactly where I had signed it the night before. I waited for several minutes, thinking the woman might appear from some back room, but the silence stretched on, and eventually I left a $20 bill on the counter, far more than the faded price list on the wall suggested, and stepped out into the morning. The parking lot was empty except for my car. The gravel was damp with dew, and I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before: weeds growing through the stones, cracks in the pavement, an overall sense of neglect that seemed at odds with the clean room I had slept in. The neon vacancy sign was dark now, and in the daylight I could see that several of the letters were broken, their glass tubes shattered and jagged. I got in my car. I drove back down that narrow road, back to the off-ramp, back to the interstate. The morning traffic was light, and I made good time, my mind already turning to the meeting ahead, the presentation I needed to deliver. the numbers I needed to remember, but something kept nagging at me. The guest book, those names without departure dates, the silence of rooms that should have been occupied, the breathing I had heard, or imagined I had heard, in that empty hallway. At the next exit, I pulled off the interstate and found a gas station. I filled my tank, bought a cup of bitter coffee, and asked the attendant, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and grease-stained fingers, if he knew the Wayside Inn. His face changed when I said the name. Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of recognition followed by something else, something I couldn't quite read. He told me he didn't know any hotel by that name. He said there was nothing at exit 147, hadn't been for years. Just an old access road that led to nowhere. I described the building, the two-story structure, the white paint, the wooden porch, the neon sign. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me that place had been torn down. A fire, he said, or maybe it was condemned. He couldn't remember exactly. It happened before his time. 10 years ago, maybe 15. There was nothing there now but an empty lot and some old foundation stones. I thanked him. I got back in my car. I sat in the parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my coffee growing cold in the cup holder beside me. I could have driven away. I should have driven away. I had a meeting to attend, a presentation to deliver, a life to return to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind at that place, something important, something I needed to understand. I drove back to exit 147. The off-ramp was there, just as it had been the night before. The narrow road wound through those same skeletal trees, and I followed it, my odometer ticking off the miles, my hands steady on the wheel despite the growing unease that twisted in my gut. The parking lot was there, the gravel was there, but the Wayside Inn was gone. In its place stood nothing but an empty clearing, overgrown with weeds and bordered by a rusted chain-link fence. I parked my car and got out, and I saw what the attendant had described. Old foundation stones, barely visible beneath the vegetation, marking the outline of a building that no longer existed. A faded sign hung crooked on the fence, its letters nearly illegible. Condemned, no trespassing. I walked to the edge of the clearing. I looked at the ground where the porch should have been, where I'd climbed the stairs the night before, where I'd walked down that rust-colored hallway and listened at all those silent doors. And I saw my footprints. They were there, pressed into the damp earth, leading from where my car was parked to where the front door should have been, leading up steps that no longer existed, leading inside a building that had been torn down years before I arrived. I stood there for a long time, staring at those footprints, trying to understand what they meant, trying to reconcile what I remembered with what I was seeing. The clean room, the creaking bed, the key in my pocket. The key. I reached into my jacket, my fingers finding the cool metal, the wooden tag still attached. Number 7. I pulled it out, held it up to the morning light, and watched it catch the sun like something real, something solid, something that could not possibly exist if the building it belonged to had been demolished a decade ago. A sound made me turn. Movement at the edge of the clearing just beyond the tree line. A figure standing in the shadows, too far away to see clearly, but close enough to make out the general shape. A woman, I thought. An older woman, with gray hair and eyes I couldn't see but could somehow feel, watching me with that same intensity I had noticed the night before. I blinked, and she was gone. I got back in my car. I drove to my meeting. I delivered my presentation. I went through the motions of a normal day, smiling and nodding and saying all the right things, while somewhere beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. I still have the key. I keep it in the drawer of my bedside table, and sometimes, late at night, I take it out and hold it in my hands. The brass is cool against my skin. The wooden tag is smooth with age. It feels real. It feels solid. But then, so did the hotel. I've driven past exit 147 3 times since that night. Each time the clearing is empty. Each time my footprints have faded a little more, worn away by rain and time, and the slow process of nature reclaiming what was always hers. Soon there will be no evidence that I was ever there at all. except for the key, and except for the dreams. They started a week after my visit, and they come more frequently now. I'm walking down that rust-colored hallway, past all those silent doors, and I can hear the breathing again. Slow, measured, perfectly synchronized with my own. I reach the end of the hall, and I find myself standing before a door I don't remember seeing before. There's no number on it, no keyhole. Just smooth, dark wood, and the sense of something waiting on the other side. I want to open it. I'm terrified to open it. I stand there, frozen between desire and dread, and then I wake up, my heart pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat, the key clutched so tightly in my hand that it leaves marks on my palm. The marks fade by morning. They always do. But I can't help wondering, if I drove back to exit 147 tonight, would the hotel be there? Would the woman be waiting behind the desk, with her gray hair and her faded eyes and her guest book full of names that never check out? Would there be a room for me? I think about that question more than I should. I think about the silence of that building, the way it pressed against me like something alive. I think about all those names in the guest book, all those people who signed in and never signed out. I think about where they might be now, those travelers who took the exit that shouldn't exist and found themselves standing in a lobby that smelled of dust and old secrets. And I think about the door at the end of my dreams, the one with no number and no keyhole, and I wonder what waits behind it. Sometimes, late at night, when the city noise fades and the silence grows thick enough to touch, I could swear I hear breathing. Slow, measured, perfectly synchronized with my own. Story 12. The fluorescent lights have a different hum after 11 o'clock. I noticed it for the first time 3 months ago. A lower frequency, almost subliminal, like the building itself was exhaling. I told myself it was the reduced electrical load, fewer computers running, fewer people breathing the recycled air. I told myself a lot of things back then. I work on the 47th floor of a glass tower that has no name, only a number. The firm handles institutional investments, the kind of money that moves silently through markets like blood through capillaries. I've been here for 6 years, long enough to know every water stain on the ceiling tiles, every crack in the break room's linoleum, every angle of shadow the emergency exit signs cast across the carpet after dark. Or so I thought. The first change was small. A door. I was walking back from the restroom at 11:43 p.m. I remember the time because I had just checked my watch, calculating how many more hours until I could justify leaving, when I noticed it. A wooden door, painted the same institutional gray as the walls, standing where there had only been a supply closet the day before. Not next to the supply closet. Where the supply closet had been, the proportions were wrong too. Taller than standard, with a brass handle that looked antique, oxidized to the color of dried blood. I stopped. I stared. I walked past it. The next morning, the supply closet was back. Same dimensions, same laminate door, same dented handle I had bumped with the mail cart 100 times. I checked the floor plans online during my lunch break, telling myself I was being thorough, that I was simply verifying what I already knew. The plans showed nothing unusual. Of course they didn't. But that night, after the cleaning crew finished their rounds and the elevator banks fell silent, I found myself walking that same hallway again. The wooden door was there, waiting. I didn't touch it. I went back to my desk and worked until my eyes burned. And when I finally left at 4 a.m., I took the long way around to the elevators. I didn't look at that hallway. I didn't let myself look. The coffee machine moved 3 weeks later. It sounds absurd when I write it down. Coffee machines don't move. They sit in their designated corners, collecting rings of dried creamer and the desperate prayers of the overworked. Ours had always been in the northwest corner of the break room, positioned so you could watch the door while your cup filled. I knew this because I'm the kind of person who notices things like sightlines, escape routes, the geometry of spaces. It's what makes me good at my job. Numbers are just patterns, and patterns are just shapes. and shapes are just the architecture of reality making itself legible. But that Wednesday night, the machine was in the southeast corner. The counter had been extended to accommodate it, or perhaps it had always been extended, the linoleum beneath it worn in a pattern that suggested years of foot traffic. The window behind it, there hadn't been a window there before, looked out onto the city's glittering expanse, 47 floors of empty air between the glass and the street. I made my coffee. I drank it standing at that impossible window, watching the lights of distant cars trace red and white rivers through the dark. It tasted the same, bitter, burnt, inadequate. When I returned to my desk, I noticed my hands were shaking, but I attributed that to the caffeine. The break room was normal the next morning. Northwest corner, no window. I checked. I started keeping a log after that. Times, locations, discrepancies. I wrote in a small notebook I kept in my jacket pocket, never on my computer, never anywhere the building's systems could see. The paranoia felt justified, still feels justified. The paintings appeared gradually, the way a headache builds, so slowly you don't realize the pressure until it becomes unbearable. Corporate art, mostly. The usual fare, abstract geometries in muted colors, photographs of inspirational landscapes, the occasional motivational platitude rendered in aggressive sans-serif fonts. I had stopped seeing them years ago, the way you stop seeing wallpaper or your own reflection. But these new ones demanded attention. They were portraits, not of anyone I recognized, not executives or founders or the architects of the firm's success. These faces belonged to no one. Middle-aged men with hollow eyes, women in outdated clothing, their expressions frozen in something that might have been anticipation or dread. All of them looking slightly to the left, as if watching something just outside the frame, something approaching. I counted 17 new portraits over the span of 2 weeks. They appeared only at night, only in the peripheral hallways, only when I was alone. During daylight hours, the walls were bare or hung with the same forgettable abstractions I had always ignored. I started photographing them with my phone, documenting evidence of something I couldn't name. But the photos never came out right. Blurred, overexposed, corrupted files that showed nothing but static and shadow. I deleted them all eventually. Looking at the static made my teeth ache. The first meeting I overheard was on a Thursday. I was working late, always working late, the deadlines breeding like cells, each one dividing into 2 more the moment it was met, when I heard voices, muffled, distant, coming from the direction of conference room H. The room had been closed for renovation since before I joined the firm. I'd never seen anyone enter or exit. I had never even seen the door open. But that night, as I walked past at 1:17 a.m., I saw light bleeding from beneath the door, and I heard them talking. I couldn't make out words at first. The voices were distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed, consonants stretching into hisses and vowels collapsing into guttural stops. I pressed my ear to the door. The wood was cold, impossibly cold, frost forming on my cheek where it touched the surface. And I listened. They were discussing projections, quarterly forecasts, the rise and fall of numbers that I almost recognized, figures that felt familiar the way a word feels familiar when you've said it too many times and it loses all meaning. But then the numbers started to change, started to become specific. I heard my address, my apartment number, the amount I paid in rent, down to the cent. I heard the date my father would be diagnosed, the name of the hospital, the room number. I pulled away from the door so quickly I stumbled, my shoulder hitting the opposite wall with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. The voices stopped. The light went out. And for one terrible moment I felt the weight of attention. Not eyes, nothing so simple as eyes, but attention, pressing against the door from the other side. I ran. I took the stairs, all 47 floors of them, my breath ragged and my heart slamming against my ribs like something trying to escape. I didn't stop until I reached the street, until the cold night air hit my face and the sounds of the city. Normal sounds, human sounds, the blessed cacophony of existence, replaced that impossible silence. My father called me the next morning. He had just gotten back from a doctor's appointment. There was something they wanted to discuss, Nothing to worry about, probably. They just wanted to run some tests. I started sleeping at the office. I told myself it was practical. The deadlines, the workload, the inefficiency of the commute. I told myself a lot of things, but the truth was simpler and more terrible. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening in those hours when the building shed its daytime skin and became something else. Something older, something that had always been there, waiting for me to notice. I set up a cot in the server room, hidden behind the humming towers of hardware. The servers never changed. The servers were constants, their blinking lights a Morse code of stability in a world that was becoming increasingly illegible. I slept in 4-hour intervals, waking at random times to patrol the floor, to document the shifts, to map the architecture of impossibility. The layout changed every night. Sometimes subtly, a partition wall 6 inches to the left, a potted plant that had been plastic now suddenly, impossibly alive, soil dark and moist with recent watering. Sometimes dramatically, entire wings of offices appearing where there had been only windows, corridors that spiraled inward like the chambers of a nautilus shell, rooms that contained other rooms in configurations that hurt to look at for too long. And always, the meetings. I found the pattern after 3 weeks. Conference room H activated at 1:17 a.m. exactly. Never earlier, never later, as if whatever process generated these gatherings was bound by a schedule I couldn't see. I learned to position myself in the adjacent hallway by 1:15, notebook in hand, pen ready to record whatever fragments of information I could glean through that frost-covered door. They talked about me constantly. My health, my finances, my relationships. They discussed my mother's eventual decline with the dispassion of actuaries, calculating probabilities and adjusting projections based on variables I couldn't identify. They talked about my apartment, the slow leak in the bathroom ceiling that would eventually compromise the structural integrity of the floor below. They talked about a woman I hadn't met yet, someone I would encounter in 7 months at a coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Vine, someone who would matter. They talked about the end. Not my end. I think I would have been relieved if it were that simple. They talked about the end. The projection, the final forecast, the point at which all the numbers converged on a single irreducible figure. They spoke of it the way traders speak of market corrections, with a mixture of anticipation and professional detachment. I never saw their faces. The windows of conference room H were tinted too dark, the glass treating light the way a black hole treats matter, absorbing, consuming, returning nothing. But sometimes, when I pressed close enough, I could see shapes moving behind the barrier, figures that were almost human, almost familiar, almost me. My coworkers started asking questions. They noticed the cot, the changes in my appearance, the way I flinched whenever someone mentioned the time. They asked if I was okay, if I needed help, if I wanted to talk to someone. Their concern was genuine, I think, but it was also useless. How do you explain that you've discovered a parallel geography within the walls of your own office? How do you articulate the terror of realizing that something has been watching you, studying you, forecasting you, for longer than you can remember? I smiled. I said I was fine. I said I was just dedicated to the work. I started checking the security feeds during the day, scrolling through hours of footage from the night before, searching for evidence of the changes I had witnessed. The cameras showed nothing. Empty hallways, locked doors, the coffee machine in its proper corner. No doors that shouldn't exist. No portraits with hollow eyes. No lights bleeding from beneath the conference room door. But there was something else. Something I almost missed. In every frame, at every angle, in every reflection on every surface of glass, there was a figure standing just behind me. Tall, indistinct, its edges blurring into the background like smoke. It never moved. It never looked directly at the camera, but it was always there, always watching, always forecasting. I printed one of the images. I carried it in my pocket for days, taking it out at random moments to confirm what I had seen. The figure was there, undeniable, its presence a violation of everything I understood about the nature of reality. But when I showed it to a coworker, just casually, just to see, he looked at me with confusion and asked what I wanted him to see. "Just me," he said. Just you standing in a hallway. The figure was only visible to me. I am writing this at 12:58 a.m. on what I believe is a Tuesday. The layout has already begun to shift. I can feel it in the air, a subtle wrongness, a displacement of pressure that makes my ears ring and my vision swim. The door to conference room H is visible at the end of the corridor, its brass handle gleaming in the emergency lighting. I have decided to go inside. I don't know what I'll find. I don't know if the meeting is something I'm observing or something I'm participating in. Perhaps it has always been about me. Perhaps I am both the subject of the forecast and the forecaster, caught in some recursive loop of observation and prediction that has no beginning and no end. My notebook is full. My phone is dead. The security cameras will show nothing, I'm certain, because the security cameras only show what the building wants them to show. But before I open that door, I want to leave a record. I want someone to know that I noticed, that I saw the changes, the shifts, the slow erosion of the boundary between what is and what is projected to be. I want someone to understand that reality is not as solid as we believe, that there are forces working in the margins, calculating our futures with a precision that should be impossible. The light is on beneath the door. The voices have started. And when I press my hand to the brass handle, so cold, always so cold, I can feel them waiting on the other side. Not malevolent, exactly. Not benevolent, just accurate. Just doing what they have always done. Just doing. Forecasting. The handle turns. I step inside. And for the first time, I see the charts clearly. Rows upon rows of data points. Each one a moment from my life. Each one leading inexorably toward a conclusion I cannot read because I am standing too close. The figures around the table turn to look at me, their faces obscured by shadow, their voices falling silent. One of them gestures toward an empty chair. It has my name on it. It has always had my name on it. Story 13. The trail was supposed to be easy. 4 miles, a gentle loop through old-growth forest, the kind of hike you do when you need to remember what silence sounds like. I'd been working 60-hour weeks for 3 months straight, and my therapist, the one I'd stopped seeing because I couldn't find the time, had told me that nature was the cheapest antidepressant on the market. So here I was, alone on a Tuesday morning in late October, watching my breath cloud in the cold mountain air and listening to nothing but the crunch of my boots on packed earth. The trailhead sign promised solitude, and for once, the promise held. No other cars in the gravel lot. No voices echoing through the trees. Just me and the pines and the thin, watery light filtering through a sky the color of old bones. I should have felt peaceful. Instead, 40 minutes into the hike, I felt something else entirely. A prickling at the back of my neck, the animal awareness of being watched. I stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, scanning the dense underbrush. The shadows between the Douglas firs that rose like pillars around me. Nothing moved, no birds sang. No, the forest had gone utterly still, as if holding its breath. I laughed at myself, the sound too loud and too sharp in that cathedral quiet. Just nerves, just the accumulated stress of too many deadlines and too little sleep finally catching up with me. I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo of the trail ahead, a narrow ribbon of dirt disappearing into green darkness, and kept walking. The clearing appeared without warning. One moment I was navigating a gentle switchback. The next, the trees opened up to reveal a rough circle of pale grass, maybe 30 feet across. In the center lay a fallen tree, its bark stripped and bleached by weather, its exposed wood the gray-white of old bone. Deep gouges marked the surrounding pines. Claw marks, I thought at first, before reason reasserted itself. Just old damage from a storm, branches torn away by wind. I checked my trail map, but the clearing wasn't marked. That seemed strange. It was distinctive enough to warrant notation, but I'd learned that park maps weren't always accurate. Budget cuts, understaffed ranger stations, the mundane explanations for small mysteries. I took another photo, this one of the fallen tree, and continued on. The trail curved north, then east. climbing gradually through a section of younger forest where the canopy grew thick enough to block most of the sky. The temperature dropped. The light took on a greenish tinge, filtered through countless needles, and I found myself walking faster without quite knowing why. After 20 minutes, I emerged into another clearing, the same clearing. I recognized the fallen tree instantly, the particular angle of its exposed roots, the way its trunk curved slightly left, the exact pattern of those gouges in the surrounding bark. I stood at the edge of the grass and felt my stomach drop, a vertiginous lurch like missing a step on a staircase. Impossible. I'd been walking steadily forward. The trail had been clear, unambiguous, no forks or junctions where I might have taken a wrong turn. And yet here I was, back at the beginning. I checked my phone for the time, 10:47 a.m. I'd been hiking for almost an hour. I pulled up the photos I'd taken, scrolling back to the first shot of this clearing, and that's when the cold crept in. Not the mountain chill, but something deeper, something that settled into my bones and refused to leave. In the photo, there was a figure. It stood at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by shadow, its back to the camera. A man, judging by the build, dark jacket, jeans, a gray backpack with orange trim. The same jacket I was wearing, the same jeans, the same backpack. But I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. I hadn't seen anyone at all. I zoomed in on the image until the pixels blurred and fragmented, trying to make out details, trying to convince myself it was a trick of light, a shadow that only looked human-shaped. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. The figure was real. The figure was me. Except I hadn't been standing there. I'd been holding the camera. I'd been standing exactly where I was standing now. I told myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe I'd encountered another hiker without registering it, someone who happened to own the same common outdoor gear. Maybe the photo had glitched somehow, a digital artifact created by the cold, or the altitude or some electromagnetic interference I didn't understand. Maybe I was more exhausted than I'd realized, and my memory of taking the photo was simply wrong. I almost believed it. I found the trail again, or a trail at least, and forced myself forward, counting my steps to stay grounded in the physical world. 100, 200, 300. The forest pressed close, the trees older and thicker now, their trunks scarred with age and weather. The silence had returned, that absolute stillness that made every sound I made feel like a violation. At step 412, I emerged into the clearing. The same clearing, the same fallen tree, the same gouges in the bark. This time I didn't bother checking the map. I sat down heavily on the pale trunk and buried my face in my hands, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way the therapist had taught me during our sessions on managing anxiety. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. Simple, mechanical. Something to focus on besides the impossible fact that I had walked in a straight line and ended up exactly where I'd started. When my heart rate had slowed enough to think clearly, I pulled out my phone again. The photo I'd taken on my second arrival showed the same figure, still at the edge of the clearing, still with its back to the camera. But the position was wrong. Completely wrong. In this shot, the figure stood to the left, near a cluster of young saplings. But I distinctly remembered aiming my camera straight ahead, toward the main trail. There was no way I could have captured that angle. And there was something else. In the first photo, the figure's hands hung loosely at its sides. In the second, one arm was raised, the hand pressed flat against a tree trunk, as if it were steadying itself, or pushing away from something. I scrolled back and forth between the images, my thumb trembling slightly against the screen. The figure hadn't moved between the shots. It had moved within them, adopting new positions that corresponded to nothing I had actually witnessed. The cold in my bones spread to my chest. I tried to leave. I abandoned the loop trail entirely, striking out through the underbrush in what I calculated was a straight line toward the road. Branches clawed at my jacket and caught in my hair. Deadfall blocked my path, forcing detours that quickly spiraled into disorientation. I checked my compass app obsessively, correcting my course again and again, pushing through the dense forest with a determination that bordered on panic. 20 minutes later, I stumbled into the clearing. I didn't scream. I wanted to, but my throat had closed up, my body refusing to give voice to what my mind couldn't accept. Instead, I stood at the edge of the pale grass and watched the fallen tree gleam dully in the thin light, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Some load-bearing wall of sanity that had been holding up the architecture of my understanding. I took another photo. I didn't want to look at it. I looked anyway. The figure had moved again. This time, it stood closer to the camera, maybe 10 feet from where I'd been standing. Still showing only its back, still wearing my clothes, still carrying my pack. One of its hands was raised now, fingers spread, reaching toward... what? The air? Something invisible? The gesture was strange, almost pleading, and I found I couldn't look away from it even as revulsion crawled up my spine. I zoomed in on the figure's head, trying to see details, trying to confirm what I already knew. The hair was the same color as mine, the same length, the same slight curl at the nape of the neck where it had grown too long. But there was something wrong with the ears. They were too high on the skull, or positioned at the wrong angle, or maybe they were simply ears that had never belonged on a human head at all. The longer I stared, the less certain I became about what I was actually seeing. The image seemed to shift and swim, my eyes unable to settle on any fixed detail. I deleted the photo. Then I deleted all of them, every shot I'd taken since entering the park, and shoved the phone into my pocket with shaking hands. The clearing watched me in silence. Time began to lose meaning. I walked the loop again, then again, then again, each circuit depositing me back in that impossible clearing like a broken record, skipping the same groove. The light never changed. The shadows never moved. The gouges in the tree bark seemed deeper each time I noticed them, the marks sharper, as if something was still working at the wood even as I watched. I stopped taking photos after the 5th loop. I couldn't bear to see what else might be in them. Instead, I focused on details, looking for any variation that might explain the trap I'd fallen into. The fallen tree was always the same curve, the same exposed roots, the same patch of lichen growing along one side. The surrounding pines were always the same pattern of scarring, the same arrangement of branches reaching overhead. Even the grass was the same, individual blades in identical positions, as if the clearing had been frozen in a single moment, and I was the only thing capable of motion within it. But something was different, something I only noticed on my 7th or 8th passage through. The gouges in the bark, the marks I'd dismissed as storm damage. They weren't random at all. They formed letters. I approached the nearest scarred tree and traced the marks with trembling fingers. The wood was rough and cold, and up close the pattern was unmistakable. Someone, or something, had carved a message into the trunk, letter by letter, deep enough to scar but shallow enough to seem accidental at a glance. Behind you. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body had locked into place, every muscle rigid with a fear that went beyond thought, beyond reason. I stared at the letters carved into the wood and listened to the silence of the clearing, and felt, with absolute certainty, that something was standing directly behind me, close enough to touch, close enough to breathe on my neck, if it breathed at all. The cold spread through me like frost on glass. Minutes passed, hours maybe. Time had become meaningless, just another rule this place had chosen to break. Eventually, the paralysis loosened enough for me to take a single step forward, then another. Then I was walking again, moving toward the far edge of the clearing on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. I didn't look back. I couldn't risk seeing what was there, or what wasn't. The 9th loop brought a new development. My phone, which I'd sworn not to touch again, buzzed in my pocket. A notification. Impossible. There'd been no signal since I'd started hiking. But the phone buzzed again, insistent, and I found myself pulling it out with the helpless obedience of a sleepwalker. The notification was from my Photos app. New memories to review. I opened it, the screen filled with images I didn't remember taking. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all of the same clearing, all featuring the same figure in my clothes, my backpack, my body. But the figure wasn't just standing in these photos. It was moving. Each image captured a different position, a different angle, a different gesture, the composite of a journey I had never witnessed. In the earliest shots, the figure stood at the clearing's edge. In later ones, it had moved closer to the center, closer to the fallen tree, closer to the camera. And in the final image, the figure had turned around. I saw my own face staring back at me, my own eyes, my own mouth, my own features rendered in perfect detail. But the expression was wrong. The eyes were too wide, the mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile if smiles could contain that much hunger. And behind those familiar eyes, I saw nothing at all. No recognition, no humanity, no spark of whatever makes a person instead of an empty shell wearing skin. The phone slipped from my fingers and landed face down in the grass. I ran. I'm still running, or walking, or standing still. I can't tell anymore. The forest looks different now. The trees older, the shadows deeper, the sky overhead a uniform gray that gives no hint of time or direction. The clearing appears sometimes, often, always. I've stopped counting how many times I've passed through it. The figure is getting closer. I don't need to check my phone to know this. I can feel it in the prickling at my neck, the weight of attention pressing against my back, the subtle wrongness in every shadow that flickers at the edge of my vision. Something is walking this loop with me, something wearing my face, something that has been patient, so patient, waiting for me to understand. The gouges in the trees have changed. New messages, carved fresh into the bark, appearing whenever I'm not watching. I've read them all now, traced them with fingers that no longer tremble because the fear has become too large for my body to contain. Almost. Soon. Turn around. I won't turn around. I know that much, even as everything else becomes uncertain. I don't know if the figure is real or imagined, if the loop is a place or a state of mind, if I'm still standing in that clearing or lying in a hospital bed somewhere, dreaming of forests I'll never escape. But I know, with the only certainty left to me, that I must not turn around. Because what if I do, and there's nothing there? What if I turn around and find only empty forest, ordinary trees, a simple trail leading back to my car and my life and my 60-hour work weeks? What if I discover that the figure I've been running from has been inside me all along, that I've been chasing myself through this impossible loop, splitting further and further from the person I used to be with every circuit? What if I turn around and become the thing in the photographs? The forest is quiet. The clearing waits ahead. I can see the pale grass through the trees, the bone-white trunk of the fallen log, the dark gouges carved into bark that might be words or might be nothing at all. I check my phone one last time. The battery shows 100%. It's been showing 100% for what feels like days. The time reads 10:47 a.m., the same time it's read since my first passage through. There's one new photo in my gallery, taken moments ago, though I don't remember lifting the camera. In it, I stand alone in the clearing, facing away from the lens, my back to whatever took the picture. Behind me, barely visible in the shadows at the frame's edge, a hand reaches toward my shoulder. It's almost touching. I put the phone away and start walking. The trail curves ahead. The clearing waits. I'm fairly certain now that it will always be waiting. Story 14. The basement smelled like old newspapers and something else. Something faintly organic, like breath trapped too long in a closed space. I noticed it the moment I stepped down those creaking wooden stairs for the first time, following the husband as he pointed out the amenities with practiced enthusiasm. A kitchenette, a bathroom with a shower that took 3 minutes to get hot, a window near the ceiling that let in a rectangle of gray light, and furniture, a bed, a desk, a lamp with a pull chain, all of it worn soft by decades of use. as if the room had been inhabited continuously since the house was built. $400 a month, utilities included. In this economy, in this city, it was practically charity. I should have asked more questions. The door was at the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind a water heater that hummed with a low, almost musical vibration. It was older than everything else down there. Solid wood, painted the same institutional green as hospital corridors, with a brass knob gone dark with tarnish. A padlock hung from a hasp, heavy and serious. The husband noticed me looking. His smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of calculation, perhaps, or warning. "Storage," he said. "Old family things. We'd appreciate it if you didn't try to open it." His wife appeared at the top of the stairs then, as if summoned by the mention of that door. She was a small woman with graying hair and a face that seemed permanently arranged into an expression of mild concern. She said nothing, but her gaze moved from her husband to me to the door and back again, tracing a triangle of attention that felt weighted with meaning I couldn't parse. "Of course," I said. "No problem." I moved in 3 days later. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and adjustment. I worked remotely, data entry, the kind of job that required attention but not thought, and the basement proved adequate for my modest needs. The couple upstairs were quiet. I heard them occasionally, footsteps crossing the floor above my head, the distant murmur of a television, the occasional creak of pipes. Normal sounds, domestic sounds. It was on the 8th night that I first heard the whispers. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, drifting in that liminal space between consciousness and dreams. The basement was dark except for the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the small window. The water heater hummed its eternal note, and beneath that hum, so soft I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, came voices. They seemed to emanate from the direction of the locked door. I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispers were indistinct, sibilant, overlapping, like multiple people speaking at once in a language that was almost English but not quite. I caught fragments that might have been words, waiting, perhaps, or watching. Or maybe neither. Maybe just the random susurration of air moving through old pipes, old walls, old spaces that had been breathing in the dark for decades before I arrived. I told myself it was nothing. The house was old. Old houses made sounds. But I didn't sleep well that night, and when I finally drifted off near dawn, I dreamed of doors that opened onto other doors, an infinite regression of thresholds, each one leading deeper into somewhere I didn't want to go. The whispers came every night after that. They began around 2 in the morning, always at the same time, as if operating on a schedule. I tried to rationalize them. I researched the acoustics of old buildings, learned about thermal expansion and contracting wood, and the way sound could travel through unexpected channels. I bought earplugs, but somehow the whispers seemed to bypass them, arriving not through my ears, but through some more direct route, as if they were being transmitted directly into the soft tissue of my brain. And then, on the 12th night, I heard my own voice. I was awake this time, sitting up in bed with my laptop open, pretending to work while actually listening. The whispers had been going for perhaps 20 minutes. The same maddening almost words, the same sense of conversation happening just beyond the threshold of comprehension. And then, cutting through the murmur like a knife through fabric, came a voice I recognized with a sick, vertiginous certainty. She doesn't know I noticed the way she looked at me. It was what I had thought, not said thought, about the wife earlier that day, when she'd brought me a plate of cookies and lingered at the top of the stairs, her eyes searching my face for something I couldn't identify. I had smiled and thanked her and watched her go, and as she turned away, I had thought those exact words in that exact order. Now they came back to me from behind the locked door, spoken in my own voice, but somehow wrong, the cadence slightly off, the emphasis landing on unexpected syllables, as if someone had learned to imitate me from a recording, but had never heard natural human speech. I sat frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The whispers continued, but now I could hear other voices too, other versions of me, speaking thoughts I recognized from days and weeks past. my irritation at a slow internet connection, my hunger contemplating dinner, my loneliness late at night, missing people I hadn't spoken to in months. All of it played back in a chorus of selves, overlapping and interweaving, a symphony of my inner life performed by something that had no right to know any of it. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, exhausted and trembling, I considered leaving. I had signed no lease. The arrangement was informal, cash monthly, a handshake agreement that either party could terminate at any time. I could pack my things, climb those stairs, hand over my key, and never look back. I could find another cheap room in another old house, put this place behind me like the bad dream it was surely becoming. But I didn't leave. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of, needed to understand. I waited until I heard the couple leave, their car pulling out of the driveway with a crunch of gravel. Then I approached the door. Up close, it seemed older than it had before. The green paint cracked and peeling in patterns that resembled faces if I looked at them from certain angles. The padlock was heavy in my hand when I tested it, but it wasn't locked. The shackle was closed but not engaged, hanging there like a prop, a suggestion of security rather than the thing itself. I removed it with shaking hands. The brass knob turned with a squeal of protest, and the door swung inward onto darkness so complete it seemed to have substance. A black velvet curtain that my eyes couldn't penetrate. Cold air drifted out, carrying that same faint organic smell I'd noticed on my first day, stronger now, more insistent. I fumbled for my phone, activated the flashlight, and stepped across the threshold. The space beyond was smaller than I'd expected, a room perhaps 10 feet square, with concrete walls and a bare dirt floor. It was empty except for a single wooden chair positioned in the center, facing a wall covered in a dense tangle of wires and equipment that seemed to belong to another era entirely. Reel-to-reel tape machines, analog recording equipment, vacuum tubes glowing with a faint amber light, though I could see no power source, no cables connecting them to anything beyond this room. And set into the wall at approximately head height, its brass grill tarnished but intact, a microphone. I approached it slowly, my footsteps muffled by the packed earth. The equipment hummed around me, the same frequency I realized with a chill as the water heater outside, the same note, as if the entire house were part of one vast machine, vibrating in resonance with something I couldn't see. The microphone was old, the kind they used in radio stations in the 1940s, all Art Deco curves and confident chrome. A small red light beside it pulsed slowly, rhythmically like a heartbeat. It was recording. I leaned closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name, and as I did, I heard my own voice speaking from somewhere behind me. From the chair, perhaps, or from the walls themselves, or from the darkness that pressed against the edges of my phone's flashlight. "He's found it," my voice said. "He's finally found it, but he doesn't understand yet. He doesn't understand what it means to be heard." I spun around. The chair was empty, the room was empty, but the whispers had started again, rising in volume, and now I could hear them clearly. Dozens of voices, hundreds perhaps, all speaking in variations of my own tone, my own cadence, reciting thoughts I'd had and thoughts I hadn't yet, memories and fears and desires, everything I'd ever kept private now broadcast into this underground space and captured by equipment that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, that ran on power from nowhere, and recorded onto tapes that spooled endlessly into the dark. I fled. I should have left then. I know that now. But when I emerged from that room, gasping and shaking, the couple was standing at the top of the basement stairs. They looked down at me with expressions I couldn't read. Not anger, not surprise, but something else. Something that might have been pity, or might have been anticipation. The wife spoke first. She said they'd been waiting for me to find it. She said everyone found it eventually, everyone who stayed long enough. Her words were calm, measured, as if she were explaining the operation of a household appliance. The room had been there since before they bought the house, since before anyone could remember. It recorded things, not sounds exactly, but thoughts, the inner voice, the constant narration that runs beneath the surface of every human mind. I asked her what happened to the recordings, where they went, Who listened to them? She smiled, and for a moment her face seemed wrong, the proportions subtly off, the angles of her cheekbones slightly too sharp. She said she didn't know. None of them knew. But sometimes, late at night, they heard things from other houses, other basements, other rooms just like this one. Voices they didn't recognize, speaking thoughts that weren't theirs. A network, perhaps. A vast underground library of human consciousness, connected by means none of them understood. Her husband put a hand on her shoulder. His fingers seemed too long. They weren't going to make me leave, they said. The room didn't work that way, but I should understand that it was too late now. The microphone had heard me. It knew my voice, my real voice, the one that spoke only inside my head. And now that it knew me, it would never stop listening. I could stay, or I could go. It didn't matter. The recording would continue. I'm still here. I don't know why. I tell myself it's because I can't afford to move, because finding another place this cheap would take months I don't have. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is that I've started to hear the other voices, the ones the wife mentioned. Late at night, when the whispers are loudest, I catch fragments of thoughts that aren't mine. A woman worrying about her mother's health. A man rehearsing an apology he'll never deliver. A teenager wondering if anyone would notice if they disappeared. Thousands of voices, maybe millions, all funneled into rooms like this one, all recorded by machines that have no business existing, all archived somewhere I can't imagine for purposes I can't fathom. And somewhere among those voices, I hear myself. Not my current thoughts. Those come through clear and immediate, a real-time broadcast of everything I think and feel. But other versions of me too, older recordings perhaps, or something else. Something that might be me in other places, other times, thinking thoughts that are almost but not quite the same as mine. Sometimes I sit in that wooden chair in the hidden room, facing the microphone, and I speak aloud. I tell it about my day, my fears. The strange comfort I've come to find in being heard, truly heard, by something that has no judgment and no mercy and no end. I don't know if I'm going crazy. I don't know if any of this is real, if there really is a network of basement rooms recording the secret thoughts of humanity, or if I've simply cracked under the pressure of loneliness and economic precarity, and a mind that was always too prone to pattern recognition, to finding meaning in noise. But every night, when the whispers start, I hear my own voice speaking back to me. And every night, it knows things it shouldn't. Things I've never told anyone. Things I've barely admitted to myself. Last night, I heard it say, "He's starting to wonder if the couple is real, if the house is real, if anything is real except the room and the microphone and the endless recording of everything he is." I hadn't thought that. Not consciously. But the moment I heard it, I recognized it as true. The microphone knew me better than I knew myself. I'm writing this as a record, a different kind of recording, one I can control. But even as I type, I hear my voice from behind the door, reading these words aloud before I've finished thinking them. It's always one step ahead, always listening, always waiting for the next thought to capture. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what any of them want. The couple, the machines, whatever vast and patient intelligence might be listening on the other end of all these captured thoughts. But I know I can't leave. Not because they won't let me, because I've realized something terrible. The voice behind the door is more me than I am. It remembers everything I've forgotten. It knows every thought I've suppressed. It speaks the truths I'm too afraid to acknowledge. And somewhere in the dark, in a room full of impossible machines, it's building something out of all those captured fragments. A complete version of me. A perfect record. I wonder sometimes if that's what happened to the people who lived here before. If they're still down there, in some form, their thoughts preserved forever in magnetic tape and amber-lit vacuum tubes. If the whispers I hear aren't just recordings but consciousnesses, minds that gave themselves to the microphone piece by piece until there was nothing left above ground, nothing left but an empty body and a room full of captured thoughts. I wonder if I'm next. The red light pulses. The recording continues. And somewhere behind the door, my voice speaks thoughts I haven't had yet. Thoughts I might never have, unless I go down there again. sit in that wooden chair, and let the microphone finish what it started. I try not to think about it, but it doesn't matter. The microphone hears everything, even the silence.